From the mist-shrouded forests and windswept coastlines of ancient Scandinavia came a people who would reshape the Roman world forever. The Vandals burst onto the stage of history, not as the barbarian destroyers of legend, but as a sophisticated Germanic civilization whose story begins in the icy reaches of northern Europe during the first centuries after Christ. Their tale intertwines with the complex tapestry of tribal movements that define this turbulent era, where survival meant constant adaptation and migration. Picture the landscape of early Sweden and Denmark, nearly 2,000 years ago. Here, among scattered settlements that dotted the harsh terrain, archaeologists have uncovered the ghostly remnants of Vandal society. Excavations throughout modern Västergötland and Scania have revealed tantalizing clues about these early peoples. The evidence speaks volumes through distinctive pottery fragments, intricate metalwork and burial customs that would later echo across their epic journey through Europe. These archaeological fingerprints tell us that the Vandals weren't just wandering nomads, but established communities with deep cultural roots. What makes this discovery even more fascinating is how their language connects them to a broader Germanic family tree. Linguistic scholars have determined that Vandalic belonged to the East Germanic branch, making them linguistic cousins to the mighty Goths, the fierce Burgundians, and other tribal groups that would dominate European history. The Gothic chronicler Jordanes, writing centuries later, traced these connections through tribal genealogies, though his work requires careful interpretation given its political motivations and distant composition date. More reliable evidence emerges from runic inscriptions and place names that demonstrate clear linguistic bridges between Scandinavian populations and their continental descendants. But why did they leave their ancestral homeland? The answer lies buried in ancient peat bogs and ice cores that reveal a dramatically changing climate. During the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Scandinavia experienced significant environmental upheaval. Their first major stop outside Scandinavia brought them to Silesia, the fertile region spanning parts of modern Poland and the Czech Republic, around the middle of the 1st century CE. Here, along the life-giving valleys of the Oder River and its tributaries, Vandal communities found themselves neighbours to existing Celtic populations, particularly the powerful Lugier Confederation. This wasn't a story of conquest and displacement, but rather a remarkable tale of cultural fusion that archaeologists continue to uncover today. Rather than simply conquering, the Vandals integrated through intermarriage, trade partnerships, and shared defence agreements. Celtic Oppida, those imposing fortified hilltop settlements that dominated the landscape, often show evidence of Vandal occupation in their upper archaeological layers. At Zawisz near modern Prague, excavations reveal a gradual cultural transition from purely Celtic material culture to mixed assemblages that include distinctly Germanic elements alongside traditional Celtic artifacts. Vandal social organization during this pre-migration period reflected the hierarchical structure typical of Germanic societies, yet with distinctive characteristics that set them apart from neighboring tribes. At the pinnacle stood the Reiks, warrior kings who combined military leadership with religious authority. These leaders controlled access to prestige goods, distributed war spoils, and served as intermediaries between human and divine realms. Below them ranked the Freelings, free warriors forming the backbone of Vandal military power, and participating in tribal assemblies where important decisions emerged through consensus-building processes. Archaeological evidence reveals significant social stratification through burial practices that speak volumes about Vandal culture. Elite graves from this period, such as those discovered at Krakow and Poznan, contain rich assemblages of weapons, jewelry, and imported Roman goods, demonstrating both wealth accumulation and extensive trade networks. These burials typically feature iron spears with elaborately decorated sockets, pattern-welded swords requiring considerable skill to produce, and bronze ornaments showing clear Roman influence. The presence of Roman coins, glass vessels, and ceramic wares indicates that Vandal elites had established regular contact with Roman merchants and possibly Roman officials. Beneath the free warrior class existed various dependent populations, including specialized craftsmen, farmers, and slaves acquired through raids or trade. Archaeological evidence for these lower social strata comes primarily from settlement excavations revealing workshops, agricultural tools, and simple dwellings, contrasting sharply with elaborate structures associated with elite sites. Slave quarters, identifiable through cramped conditions and lack of personal possessions, appear at several major Vandal settlements, indicating that unfree labor played a significant role in the tribal economy. Religious practices among pre-migration Vandals centered on a polytheistic system sharing fundamental elements with other Germanic traditions, while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. Archaeological evidence from cult sites across Silesia reveals a complex ritual landscape involving sacred groves, springs, and constructed temples. At Shuars, excavations have uncovered wooden temple structures containing votive deposits of weapons, jewelry, and animal bones, providing insights into Vandal religious practices. The Vandal pantheon included deities associated with war, fertility, and the natural world, though specific names and attributes remain largely unknown due to absent written records from this period. Archaeological evidence suggests that Wodan, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom known throughout the Germanic world, held particular importance among Vandal warriors. Weapon deposits found in bog sites across former Vandal territories often show evidence of ritual destruction, with spears bent and swords broken before deposition, practices consistent with sacrificial offerings to war gods. This foundation in Silesia would prove crucial as the Vandals prepared for the great migrations that would take them across the known world, ultimately establishing kingdoms that would challenge Rome itself. The warrior ethos that defined Vandal identity permeated every aspect of their society, from religious ceremonies to social organization. Young men underwent transformative initiation rites that marked their passage from boyhood to warrior status, ceremonies that likely involved ritual combat, sacred oaths, and the ceremonial receiving of weapons from established fighters. Archaeological evidence supporting these practices emerges from weapon deposits discovered at cult sites and the consistent presence of arms in male burials from adolescence onward, suggesting that warrior identity began early and lasted throughout life. The famous comitatus, known from Latin sources, formed the backbone of Vandal military organization and social structure. These warrior bands consisted of young fighters bound to experienced leaders through unbreakable bonds of personal loyalty and shared participation in raids and battles. But these groups served purposes far beyond warfare, functioning as labor gangs for major construction projects, hunting parties for large-scale expeditions, and ceremonial units during religious festivals. Members lived together in communal longhouses, shared meals prepared at common hearths, and participated in elaborate drinking ceremonies that reinforced group solidarity and individual commitment to the band. The inevitable collision between Vandal expansion and Roman power began during the 2nd century CE as tribal pressure intensified along the Danube frontier and Roman territorial ambitions brought these two civilizations into direct, often violent contact. The Marcomannic Wars marked the opening chapter of sustained military interaction between these peoples, though tracking specific Vandal participation proves challenging due to Roman tendencies to group various Germanic tribes under collective designations in their historical records. Archaeological evidence from fortified positions along the Middle Danube suggests that Vandal warbands joined the broader coalition of tribes that challenged Roman authority during this critical period. Weapon discoveries from battlefield sites near Carnuntum and Vindobona include spear points and shield bosses consistent with Vandal material culture, though definitive attribution remains problematic given the remarkable similarities in Germanic military equipment across different tribal groups. These finds tell us that whether officially recognized or not, Vandal warriors were present when Germanic forces clashed with Roman legions. Roman responses to these frontier challenges involved both military action and sophisticated diplomatic initiatives designed to manage tribal movements and prevent large-scale invasions. Marcus Aurelius established intricate networks of client relationships with Germanic leaders, providing subsidies and official recognition in exchange for border security and military service. The 3rd century CE witnessed a dramatic escalation in Vandal involvement in frontier conflicts, as the Roman Empire faced mounting pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The crisis of the 3rd century created unprecedented opportunities for Germanic tribes to exploit Roman weakness, with Vandal raiders participating in the devastating incursions that penetrated deep into imperial territory, sometimes reaching within sight of Rome itself. Archaeological evidence from destroyed Roman settlements in Pannonia and Noricum includes artifacts consistent with Vandal material culture, strongly suggesting their active participation in these destructive campaigns that nearly brought the empire to its knees. Vandal military effectiveness during this turbulent period resulted from their remarkable ability to adapt Roman tactical innovations while maintaining traditional Germanic fighting methods. Excavated weapons from 3rd century battle sites reveal clear Roman influence in design and construction, with Vandal smiths producing Sparta-style long swords and improved spear points based directly on Roman prototypes. Shield construction evolved to incorporate Roman engineering techniques while maintaining distinctive Germanic decorative traditions, creating hybrid designs that perfectly reflected the cultural synthesis occurring along the contested frontier zones. The Goths, themselves driven by relentless pressure from steppe nomads, had consolidated their formidable power base along the Black Sea coast and began pushing aggressively westward into regions previously controlled by other Germanic groups. Archaeological evidence from sites across modern Poland reveals the sudden violent abandonment of Vandal settlements during this period. At Sobotka, excavations have uncovered layers of ash and destruction dating precisely to the late 3rd century, with broken pottery and scattered metalwork suggesting hasty evacuation rather than gradual planned migration. Similar patterns appear at Rotwar and Krakow, where the archaeological record shows abrupt cessation of typical Vandal material culture, immediately replaced by artifacts consistent with Gothic presence. The speed of this displacement clearly indicates that military pressure rather than gradual demographic shifts drove the Vandals from their ancestral homeland, forcing them to abandon generations of accumulated wealth and cultural development. Gothic expansion operated through a devastating combination of direct military conquest and the strategic establishment of tributary relationships with smaller tribes. Gothic warbands, equipped with superior cavalry tactics learned from steppe peoples, possessed significant advantages over traditional Germanic infantry formations. Their masterful use of composite bows and mounted archers allowed them to harass enemy formations while avoiding decisive close combat, gradually wearing down resistance through repeated raids and skirmishes that exhausted defenders' resources and morale. Contemporary Roman sources, particularly Ammianus Marcellinus, described the chaos that engulfed the Trans-Danubian regions during this period, noting the appearance of new tribal confederations and the complete disappearance of previously established groups. The pressure from Gothic expansion coincided with an even more disruptive force emerging from the Asian steppes, the Huns, whose westward movement would reshape the entire European world and force the Vandals toward their ultimate destiny in Africa. The arrival of this nomadic storm from the east fundamentally transformed the delicate balance of power across the vast Pontic-Caspian steppes, unleashing waves of migration that crashed through the Germanic world like a relentless tide. The Hunnic military machine, built around lightning-fast cavalry units capable of striking across enormous distances, proved catastrophically effective against the settled agricultural societies of Eastern Europe. These weren't random raiders, but a sophisticated war machine that could appear anywhere, strike with devastating force, and vanish before enemies could mount effective resistance. Archaeological traces of Hunnic presence emerge primarily through their distinctive burial customs and specialized horse equipment scattered across the western steppes. Hunnic graves tell fascinating stories through their contents. Composite bows designed for mounted warfare, horse bits adorned with elaborate bronze decorations that speak to their riders' status, and bronze cauldrons used for mysterious ritual purposes. The westward spread of these artifacts creates a clear trail marking Hunnic expansion and the systematic displacement of existing populations at sites like Intercisa, where layers of destruction mark the moment when the old world ended and the new began. This Hunnic expansion triggered an incredibly complex chain reaction of tribal movements that would reshape European history. Gothic groups fled desperately westward, smashing into other Germanic peoples, who in turn pressed violently against their own neighbours in an endless cascade of displacement and conflict. The Vandals discovered themselves trapped in this avalanche of migration, completely unable to resist the combined pressure flowing from multiple directions simultaneously. Roman frontier defences, already stretched to breaking point by the ongoing crisis of the 3rd century, proved utterly incapable of containing or channeling these massive population movements that threatened to overwhelm the civilized world. Confronted with the catastrophic loss of their ancestral territories, Vandal tribal leaders embarked on an unprecedented process of confederation that would completely transform their political organization and military capabilities. The two primary Vandal groups, the Hasdingi and Silingi, had previously maintained entirely separate identities and carefully guarded territorial boundaries. The Hasdingi, whose name possibly derives from ancient words meaning long-haired ones, had dominated the northern portions of Vandal territory along the Upper Oder River Valley for generations. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Hasdingi maintained particularly strong connections to their Scandinavian origins, with burial practices and material culture showing remarkable continuities with their northern heritage. The Silingi, named after the Silesia region they had come to control, occupied the southern and eastern portions of traditional Vandal territory. Their material culture displays far greater Celtic influence, reflecting their extensive interaction with pre-existing populations throughout the region. Silingi settlements typically featured more sophisticated defensive earthworks and demonstrated evidence of intensive agricultural practices, suggesting their successful adaptation to controlling fixed territories against persistent external threats. The Confederation process demanded unprecedented cooperation between these historically separate groups who had sometimes been rivals. Archaeological evidence from sites like Shuwalki reveals the construction of massive new defensive works designed to accommodate populations from multiple tribal groups simultaneously. These impressive fortifications incorporated both Hasdingi and Silingi construction techniques, creating hybrid architectural styles that perfectly reflected the new political reality emerging from necessity. Weapon deposits from this critical period show remarkable standardization of military equipment across traditional tribal boundaries, clearly indicating coordinated preparation for large-scale warfare that would require unified command and tactics. The formation of the Vandal Confederation involved incredibly complex negotiations over leadership structures, resource distribution, and military command hierarchies. Traditional Germanic political systems based on personal loyalty between individual warriors and their chiefs had to be completely restructured to accommodate the needs of a much larger and more diverse population. The ingenious solution appears to have involved a dual leadership system, maintaining separate kings for the Hasdingi and Silingi, while establishing overall coordination mechanisms for major military campaigns and large-scale migrations. Religious practices played an absolutely crucial role in legitimizing this new confederation among peoples who viewed divine approval as essential for political authority. Archaeological evidence from cult sites shows the construction of impressive new temples and ritual spaces specifically designed to accommodate much larger gatherings than previously possible. Weapon deposits from this period include sacred items from both tribal groups, strongly suggesting joint ceremonies that reinforced political unity through shared religious observance and mutual divine blessing. The adoption of common symbols and decorative motifs across previously distinct tribal territories indicates deliberate, systematic efforts to create a unified cultural identity that could bind together these diverse peoples under a single banner. Their inclusion completely transformed the Confederation from a purely Germanic tribal alliance into a sophisticated multi-ethnic coalition, fully capable of challenging Roman military supremacy on equal terms. Archaeological evidence for Allan presence among the Vandals emerges through their distinctive burial practices and specialized horse equipment discovered at sites across their entire migration route. Allan graves typically feature elaborate horse burials alongside human remains, reflecting ancient steppe traditions of accompanying deceased warriors with their prized mounts into the afterlife. The horses themselves show clear evidence of selective breeding for exceptional size and speed, indicating sophisticated knowledge of animal husbandry specifically adapted to military requirements. Allan metalwork, characterized by distinctive geometric patterns and stylized animal motifs derived from steppe artistic traditions, appears regularly alongside Germanic artifacts at sites associated with the Confederation. The military integration of Allan cavalry with Germanic infantry created revolutionary tactical possibilities that would prove absolutely decisive in upcoming campaigns against Roman forces. Allan mounted archers provided the Confederation with unmatched reconnaissance capabilities and the crucial ability to harass enemy formations at long range, while Germanic warriors maintained their traditional role as heavily armored infantry capable of sustained close combat. This deadly combination of mobility and staying power allowed the Confederation to adapt their tactics perfectly to different opponents and varying terrain conditions, making them nearly unbeatable in open warfare. The alliance with the Alans also delivered significant diplomatic advantages, as these nomadic peoples maintained extensive networks of contacts across the steppe world and among other displaced populations seeking new homes. These connections provided invaluable intelligence about Roman military movements, detailed information about other migrating tribes, and precise knowledge about potential targets for raids or outright conquest. With their confederation firmly established and their alliance secured, the Vandals began their epic migration westward through the Carpathian Basin, a journey that would take them through Pannonia and Dacia. The migration proceeded methodically in carefully planned stages, with the Confederation establishing temporary settlements while sending scouts ahead to identify suitable routes and gather crucial intelligence about conditions further west. Archaeological evidence from sites across modern Hungary and Romania tracks this Vandal migration through distinctive artifact assemblages and settlement patterns that tell the story of their passage. At Arquincum, near modern Budapest, excavations have revealed a dramatic layer of destruction followed immediately by temporary occupation, featuring typical Vandal material culture. The site shows clear evidence of systematic dismantling of Roman structures, with useful materials carefully removed for transport while unnecessary elements were deliberately left behind. This organized pattern suggests deliberate, planned occupation rather than random destruction born of barbaric impulse. However, not every encounter along their westward journey erupted into violence and bloodshed. Archaeological evidence reveals a far more complex picture of interactions that included peaceful negotiations, profitable trade arrangements, and temporary cooperation between different peoples struggling to survive in this chaotic world. At Sirmium, excavation layers tell a fascinating story through mixed assemblages of Vandal, Alan, and Roman artifacts discovered together, clearly indicating extended periods of coexistence and active cultural exchange that benefited all parties involved. The Confederation's passage through Dacia required delicate negotiations with Gothic groups who had already established themselves throughout the region, following their own desperate displacement from territories further east. These diplomatic encounters proved incredibly complicated due to competing claims over territory and resources, as well as drastically different relationships that various groups maintained with Roman authorities scattered throughout the region. Several Gothic leaders had successfully established foederati relationships with Rome, receiving official recognition and subsidies in exchange for military service and border protection. These Gothic chieftains viewed the approaching Vandal migration as a direct threat to their carefully negotiated positions and the privileges they had earned through cooperation with imperial authorities. Archaeological evidence from sites like Apretum reveals dramatic destruction layers that may reflect violent conflicts between different Germanic groups during this turbulent period, as established populations sought to protect their territories from desperate newcomers. The Confederation's military organization underwent revolutionary changes during this migration to meet the unprecedented challenges of moving enormous populations across hostile territory, while maintaining devastating combat effectiveness against any opponents they might encounter. The traditional Germanic warband structure expanded dramatically to accommodate vastly larger numbers and increasingly complex logistical requirements that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Archaeological evidence suggests the systematic development of specialized roles within their military hierarchy, with carefully selected warriors designated as elite scouts responsible for reconnaissance, others assigned as dedicated guards protecting non-combatants during movement, and still others trained as specialists in siege warfare techniques or advanced cavalry tactics, learned from their invaluable Alan allies. Moving this massive confederation through the challenging Carpathian Basin demanded meticulous planning to ensure adequate supplies of food, clean water, and fodder for the enormous numbers of people and animals involved in this epic journey. The Confederation leadership demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking by following river valleys whenever possible, taking full advantage of natural transportation routes and guaranteed access to essential water sources that could sustain their massive population. Archaeological evidence from temporary campsites along these ancient routes reveals impressive systematic organization, with distinct areas carefully designated for different essential activities, including metalworking for weapon maintenance, large-scale food preparation for thousands of people, and specialized animal care for the livestock that represented much of their accumulated wealth. As the Confederation pressed relentlessly westward, they encountered increasingly determined resistance from Roman forces, and local populations who had somehow managed to maintain some degree of organization despite the general collapse of imperial authority throughout the region. The heavily fortified city of Sirmium, strategically positioned at the vital confluence of the Save and Danube rivers, represented a formidable obstacle to their continued westward movement toward the promised lands of Gaul. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests the Vandals conducted a systematic siege of this crucial city for several grueling months, constructing elaborate earthworks and sophisticated siege engines before ultimately making the strategic decision to bypass it entirely, rather than expending the precious resources necessary for a prolonged direct assault that might cost them dearly. This decision to avoid costly sieges reflected the Confederation's brilliant strategic priorities during this critical phase of their migration. Their ultimate goal wasn't territorial conquest of these intermediate regions, but rather safe passage to distant areas offering far better prospects for permanent settlement and long-term prosperity. Extended military campaigns would have consumed irreplaceable resources desperately needed for the migration, while exposing the entire Confederation to dangerous counterattacks from Roman reinforcements or rival Germanic tribes seeking to eliminate competitors. The leadership consistently demonstrated remarkable strategic sophistication in carefully balancing immediate military objectives with the broader survival needs of their entire people, a delicate calculation that would determine their ultimate success or catastrophic failure. By late 406 CE, the Vandal Confederation had finally reached the legendary Rhine frontier, the traditional boundary separating the Germanic world from the wealthy Roman province of Gaul. Here they encountered numerous other displaced populations, including various Suebi groups who had been driven from their own ancestral territories by the same relentless pressures that had forced the Vandals from their homeland. The convergence of multiple desperate tribal groups along the Rhine created an absolutely massive concentration of military power that Roman frontier defences proved utterly incapable of containing or redirecting. The famous Rhine crossing of December 31st, 406 CE, stands as one of the most pivotal moments in late antique history, marking the precise moment when the barbarian world burst into the Roman heartland. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Rhine frontier suggests this crossing involved tens of thousands of people, including battle-hardened warriors, their families, massive herds of livestock, and enormous baggage trains carrying the accumulated possessions and cultural treasures of entire tribal communities fleeing their destroyed homelands. This crossing wasn't a spontaneous event born of desperation, but rather the carefully planned culmination of months of detailed preparation and complex coordination between different tribal groups with varying objectives and capabilities. The Vandals, Suebi, and Alans had established a sophisticated loose alliance specifically for this crossing, that each group maintained its own distinct leadership structures and ultimate strategic objectives beyond the immediate goal of reaching Gaul. The precise timing of this crossing on the final day of the Roman year may have been chosen for powerful symbolic reasons, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another, or simply reflected practical considerations of favourable weather conditions and optimal river freezing that made the crossing possible. Roman frontier forces concentrated in heavily fortified positions along the Rhine proved completely incapable of preventing or even significantly hindering this massive crossing. The sheer scale of the barbarian coalition utterly overwhelmed defensive preparations originally designed to handle much smaller and more manageable incursions by individual tribal groups. Archaeological evidence from Roman frontier fortifications reveals hasty abandonment, with valuable military equipment abandoned in place and defensive works partially dismantled by retreating garrisons who recognized the impossibility of their situation and chose survival over futile heroic stands. The frozen Rhine beneath their feet represented far more than a simple geographical crossing for the Vandal Confederation. It marked their complete transformation from desperate displaced refugees into active agents of destruction within the Roman Empire's most prosperous heartland. The ice that had facilitated their passage into Gaul during the final hours of 406 CE would inevitably melt with the approaching spring, but the devastation they would unleash across this wealthy province would permanently reshape the political landscape of Western Europe for countless generations to come. The immediate aftermath of this historic crossing revealed the true terrifying scale of the barbarian coalition that had penetrated supposedly impregnable Roman defences. Archaeological excavations at Mogontiacum have uncovered extensive destruction layers dating precisely to early 407 CE, with burned timber, collapsed masonry, and scattered coins providing stark evidence of systematic urban destruction carried out with military precision rather than random barbaric violence. The city's strategic position at the confluence of the Rhine and Main rivers had made it an absolutely crucial Roman administrative centre controlling river traffic and regional governance. But its accumulated wealth also made it an irresistible target for the newly arrived barbarian forces seeking to establish their presence and fund their continued campaigns. The sack of Mainz demonstrated the Vandals' dramatically evolved approach to urban warfare, skillfully combining traditional Germanic assault tactics with sophisticated siege techniques learned during their long migration through formerly Roman territories. Archaeological evidence from the city's defensive walls shows concentrated damage at specific structural weak points, suggesting carefully coordinated attacks rather than random destruction driven by barbarian fury. Battering ram impacts remain clearly visible on ancient gate structures, while extensive fire damage to wooden superstructures indicates the systematic use of incendiary devices designed to breach fortifications efficiently and terrorize defenders into surrender. The recovered spear points tell a remarkable story about Vandal military organization that reveals sophisticated centralized weapon manufacturing systems. Despite the seemingly chaotic mobile nature of their confederation, these weren't crude barbarian weapons hastily forged in individual tribal workshops, but standardized military equipment produced through coordinated manufacturing processes that ensured consistent quality and effectiveness across their entire army. This level of organization demonstrates that the Vandals had transformed from a collection of displaced tribes into a genuine military machine. Excavated sword fragments showcase the continued mastery of pattern-welded blade construction, but with fascinating modifications that clearly reflect hard-won combat experience against Roman opponents who fought with different tactics and equipment than traditional Germanic enemies. These weren't simply traditional weapons, but evolved designs specifically adapted to counter Roman military techniques and exploit weaknesses discovered through countless battles across the European countryside. Shield bosses discovered at siege sites revealed deliberate reinforcement patterns specifically engineered to withstand the devastating impact of Roman projectile weapons, including ballista, bolts, and catapult stones. The Vandals had learned through bitter experience that their traditional Germanic shields, designed for close combat against other tribal warriors, required significant modification to survive the sophisticated artillery that Roman engineers deployed from city walls and fortified positions. The Confederation's cavalry arm, completely dominated by their Alan warrior allies, employed revolutionary tactics that proved absolutely devastating against Roman defensive strategies, originally designed to counter traditional Germanic infantry assaults. These Alan-mounted archers could harass Roman formations from well beyond the effective range of foot soldiers, using their superior mobility to exploit gaps in defensive lines and ruthlessly pursue fleeing enemies who had no hope of escape. Archaeological evidence from sites like Borbetomagus reveals extensive horse remains with distinctive steppe-style equipment, providing concrete confirmation of nomadic cavalry units participating in major siege operations that would reshape the military landscape of Europe. These weren't simply raiders on horseback, but professional cavalry formations with specialized equipment and tactics that gave the Vandals unprecedented battlefield advantages. The epic Siege of Worms in 407 CE brilliantly demonstrated the Confederation's evolved ability to reduce heavily fortified Roman positions through sustained military operations that combined traditional Germanic assault tactics with sophisticated engineering techniques learned during their long migration. The city's strategic location along the Rhine had made it an absolutely crucial link in the imperial defensive system, protected by substantial walls and garrisoned with local limitain units, supplemented by regular army detachments drawn from Rhine frontier forces. Archaeological excavations within the ruined city have revealed multiple distinct destruction phases, clearly indicating that this siege involved several carefully planned assault phases rather than a single overwhelming barbarian attack. This methodical approach demonstrates that the Vandals had completely abandoned random destructive raids in favor of systematic military campaigns designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. Evidence from the siege, works constructed outside Worms, reveals sophisticated engineering capabilities that the Vandals had steadily developed during their epic migration across hostile territory. Earthwork remains clearly indicate the construction of elaborate circumvallation lines specifically designed to isolate the city from potential external relief forces, while simultaneously protecting the besiegers from dangerous sorties launched by the desperate garrison trapped inside. The systematic nature of urban destruction, unleashed across Gaul, reflects deliberate strategic choices rather than the random violence typically associated with barbarian raids. At Argentoratum, archaeological layers tell a fascinating story through selective demolition patterns that targeted administrative buildings and military installations, while residential areas suffered significantly less comprehensive damage. This discriminating approach strongly suggests that Vandal forces deliberately prioritized the complete elimination of Roman governmental infrastructure, while potentially seeking to preserve civilian populations that could provide valuable tribute payments or essential labor services for their expanding confederation. Contemporary chroniclers describe numerous attempts to establish workable relationships with these invaders, though these arrangements invariably favored the barbarians heavily while providing Romans with little more than temporary survival. The failure of traditional foederati arrangements between Roman authorities and the Vandal Confederation stemmed from fundamental misunderstandings about barbarian political organization and strategic objectives. Roman negotiators, thoroughly accustomed to dealing with individual tribal kings who could reliably commit their followers to specific agreements. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with attempted treaty negotiations reveals the construction of temporary meeting places and the careful deposition of diplomatic gifts intended to demonstrate Roman goodwill and barbarian status. However, these diplomatic efforts consistently failed to produce lasting agreements that could stabilize the deteriorating situation. Tribute arrangements proved equally unsuccessful as Roman officials completely lacked the resources necessary to satisfy escalating barbarian demands, while the Confederation possessed overwhelming military strength to simply take whatever they wanted through force rather than negotiation. Cone hordes buried during this desperate period across Gaul reflect the frantic attempts of Roman administrators to preserve imperial resources from inevitable barbarian seizure. The largest of these treasure hoards, discovered near Treveri, contains over 3,000 gold and silver coins, dating precisely to the early 5th century, representing a substantial portion of the regional treasury that desperate officials attempted to save for future imperial restoration that would never come. The Vandal Confederation's remarkable military success throughout Gaul stemmed partly from their impressive ability to adapt their tactics to completely different types of opponents and varying terrain conditions, with a flexibility that Roman forces couldn't match. Against heavily fortified Roman cities, they employed formal siege techniques supplemented by devastating cavalry raids that systematically prevented the arrival of relief forces that might break their stranglehold. When confronting Roman field armies in open battle, they used their superior mobility advantage to choose favorable fighting conditions, while consistently avoiding pitched battles against superior numbers that might result in catastrophic losses they couldn't afford. Archaeological evidence from multiple battlefield sites shows extensive remains of Roman military equipment abandoned during hasty retreats, clearly indicating that imperial forces frequently chose strategic withdrawal over direct confrontation with this formidable enemy. The Confederation's logistical capabilities during these Gallic campaigns demonstrated absolutely remarkable organizational sophistication for what Romans dismissed as a primitive nomadic society. Archaeological evidence from temporary campsites reveals sophisticated large-scale food processing operations, including substantial grain storage facilities and extensive livestock pens capable of accommodating the substantial herds that represented much of their accumulated wealth and mobile food supply. The systematic integration of captured Roman military equipment and personnel into Vandal forces provided significant tactical advantages during these transformative Gallic campaigns. Roman engineers, whether serving voluntarily or under various forms of compulsion, contributed invaluable expertise in siege warfare and fortification construction that dramatically enhanced barbarian military capabilities beyond traditional Germanic methods. By 409 CE, the Vandal Confederation had completely exhausted the immediate opportunities available in devastated Gaul while facing mounting pressure from Roman counterattacks and increasing competition from other barbarian groups that had followed their successful example by crossing the frozen Rhine. The time had come to seek new horizons and fresh conquests that would secure their ultimate destiny. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout eastern Gaul reveals telling destruction layers that may actually reflect vicious fighting between different barbarian groups, rather than the expected Roman barbarian conflicts that dominated earlier campaigns. These discoveries paint a sobering picture of former allies turning against each other as resources dwindled and competition intensified, forcing difficult decisions about the Confederation's future survival. The momentous decision to cross the towering Pyrenees into Hispania represented far more than desperate flight from an exhausted province. This was a carefully calculated strategic choice, based on valuable intelligence about conditions in the wealthy Iberian Peninsula that promised solutions to their growing problems. Roman military defences in Hispania were known to be significantly weaker than those they had already overcome in Gaul, while the province's legendary agricultural wealth and abundant mineral resources offered genuinely attractive prospects for permanent settlement that could sustain their people for generations. The mountain crossing itself presented formidable logistical challenges that would have defeated less experienced peoples. The historic crossing of the Pyrenees in 409 CE required unprecedented coordination between the various elements of the barbarian coalition that had systematically devastated Gaul over the previous 3 years. The Vandals, Suebi, and Alans had somehow maintained their fragile alliance despite mounting tensions over resource distribution and increasingly contentious territorial claims that threatened their continued cooperation. The remarkable division of Hispania among the barbarian confederates by lot represented an ingenious attempt to prevent the destructive conflicts that had already begun to emerge in Gaul over territorial rights and tribute collection systems. This extraordinary arrangement, described in detail by contemporary chroniclers as a formal drawing of lots, allocated specific regions to each group, while theoretically maintaining the overall cooperation that had brought them such unprecedented success. The Hastingi Vandals received Galiatia in the mountainous northwest, a region encompassing modern northwestern Spain and northern Portugal. Meanwhile, Silingi settlements throughout Baetica demonstrate continued influence from their extensive interactions with Roman provincial culture during their years in Silesia and Gaul. Alan sites display their characteristic nomadic material culture successfully adapted to the Mediterranean environment, with horse equipment cleverly modified for the dramatically different terrain and climate conditions of Iberia. The systematic nature of this territorial division clearly suggests sophisticated political negotiations between barbarian leaders, mediated by their shared military success and mutual dependence during the challenging Pyrenean crossing. This arrangement represented a delicate compromise between different strategic objectives and cultural preferences, allowing each group to pursue its own distinct settlement policies while maintaining the military alliance that had proven devastatingly effective against Roman opposition. The Hasdingi Vandals, under their ambitious King Gunderic, suddenly found themselves masters of Galatia, a challenging region that presented both extraordinary opportunities and formidable obstacles that would test their capacity for political adaptation and administrative innovation. This mountainous territory, with its Celtic-influenced population and well-established Roman infrastructure, demanded completely different skills than those required for military conquest. Archaeological excavations at the magnificent city of Bracara Augusta reveal the remarkably complex process through which Vandal elites systematically established their authority over existing Roman administrative structures that had governed the region for centuries. This city had served as the prestigious capital of the Roman province of Galicia, and its substantial public buildings, impressive forum complex, and elegant residential districts represented the accumulated wealth and organizational sophistication of centuries of imperial rule. Rather than destroying these magnificent structures, as they had methodically done during their devastating campaigns throughout Gaul, the Hasdingi made the revolutionary choice to occupy and skillfully adapt them for their own purposes. This decision demonstrated remarkable political maturity and practical wisdom that would define their approach to kingdom building. The fascinating transformation of Roman administrative buildings into Vandal royal residences demonstrates their sophisticated understanding of the crucial symbolic importance of architectural power in legitimizing their rule. At Bracara Augusta, the former governor's palace reveals extensive modifications dating precisely to the early 5th century, with Germanic-style wooden partitions expertly installed within existing Roman stone structures and traditional Vandal decorative elements carefully incorporated into existing mosaic floors. These thoughtful changes reflect a deliberate strategy of cultural synthesis specifically designed to legitimize barbarian rule, while maintaining the practical advantages of Roman organizational systems that had proven effective for centuries. The Hasdingi approach to legal administration reveals the pragmatic flexibility that consistently characterized successful barbarian kingdoms throughout this transformative period. Archaeological evidence from legal archives miraculously preserved in ecclesiastical contexts shows the continued use of established Roman legal procedures for disputes involving the indigenous Hispano-Roman population, while traditional Germanic customary law governed relations within the Vandal community itself. This sophisticated dual system required considerable administrative expertise, as royal officials needed to thoroughly understand both legal traditions and determine which applied to specific cases. Inscriptional evidence from tombstones and public monuments throughout Galatia during the early 5th century demonstrates the gradual integration of Vandal and Roman naming conventions and social hierarchies that created a unique hybrid culture. Vandal nobles systematically adopted prestigious Latin titles and Roman administrative terminology, while carefully retaining their Germanic personal names and clan affiliations that connected them to their ancestral heritage. A particularly revealing inscription from Astorga commemorates Gundaricus Rex Vandalorum, using classical Latin formulaic language to describe a Germanic king while maintaining traditional Vandal royal epithets in vernacular portions of the text, that proclaimed his legitimacy to both Roman and barbarian audiences. The process of Romanization among Vandal elites accelerated dramatically as they encountered the practical requirements of governing settled agricultural populations, whose prosperity depended on sophisticated systems they had never managed before. The Vandal royal court in Galatia attracted Roman intellectuals, experienced administrators, and skilled craftsmen who provided absolutely essential expertise for the effective functioning of this new kingdom that bridged two worlds. The mining enterprises that had made Galatia profitable to the Roman Empire persisted under Vandal authority, though with restructured organizational frameworks that mirrored Germanic social rankings. Archaeological digs at gold extraction sites near Atoga show ongoing mining operations throughout the early 5th century, with proof of both Roman technical approaches and Germanic management staff. Incorporating these operations into the Vandal royal treasury supplied essential resources for sustaining military units and managing diplomatic exchanges with surrounding powers. But here's where things get really interesting. The Sauline Vandals and their ruler Fredbul confronted entirely different obstacles in founding their realm in Bitica. The productive agricultural territory of southern Hispania focused on the Guadalquivir River basin. This land, the Salingi strategy for territorial dominance differed dramatically from their Hastingi relatives, reflecting both the unique character of their allocated territory and the distinctive cultural influences they had absorbed throughout their migration journey. Archaeological findings from Cordoba reveal more widespread destruction and reconstruction than what occurred in Galatia, with Salingi forces methodically dismantling Roman defensive structures while building new fortifications adapted to Germanic military needs. Now this is where the real drama begins. The integration of Salingi warriors into Betica's agricultural economy created friction that would endure throughout the entire period of Vandal dominance in the region. Germanic military customs emphasized cattle raising and raiding as core economic activities, while the Mediterranean agricultural framework of Biotetica relied on intensive cultivation of permanent crops like olive groves and vineyards that required long-term commitment and specialized knowledge. Archaeological findings from rural locations show efforts to merge these contrasting economic approaches with mixed outcomes that varied significantly across different areas. The disputes that developed between Germanic settlers and native Hispano-Roman populations in Boeotia originated partly from fundamental differences in farming practices and land use philosophies. Roman villa estates had functioned as integrated economic systems combining agricultural production, manufacturing operations, and commercial activities under centralized leadership. Germanic settlement arrangements based on individual family properties and communal grazing privileges proved challenging to harmonize with these established systems without major disruption to productivity. Archaeological excavations throughout Beta reveal evidence of violent confrontations during the early phase of Silingi settlement. At Villa de la Dehesa, near Assar, destruction layers dating to approximately 410 show evidence of systematic burning and deliberate destruction of agricultural infrastructure, including olive presses and grain storage facilities. The following occupation phases reveal attempts to reconstruct these facilities using Germanic building techniques, though with considerably reduced capacity and effectiveness. The military structure of both Vandal kingdoms reflected the necessity to balance traditional Germanic warrior culture with the practical demands of territorial defense and internal security. Archaeological evidence from fortified locations across both Galicia and Baetica shows the construction of defensive installations that combine Germanic military engineering with Roman fortification methods. These hybrid fortifications featured Germanic timber and earthwork construction reinforced with Roman stone masonry and equipped with siege engines based on imperial military technology. The Vandal military framework during this era maintained the traditional Germanic emphasis on personal loyalty between warriors and their commanders, while adapting to the requirements of governing settled territories. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits at religious sites shows the continued significance of ritual practices in maintaining military unity, with offerings of arms and armor serving to strengthen the sacred connections between kings and their warrior followers. However, these traditional practices were enhanced by Roman-style military organization, including standardized equipment, regular training, and systematic logistics. Their forces combined Gothic heavy cavalry with Roman infantry tactics and siege techniques, creating a military machine specifically designed for operations within the imperial frontier system. The strategic situation facing the Vandal kingdoms in Hispania deteriorated rapidly as Visigothic forces began systematic campaigns against barbarian settlements throughout the peninsula, setting the stage for the dramatic confrontations that would reshape the entire region. The first decisive clash between Visigothic and Vandal armies erupted in 416 CE, when Wallia's forces crossed the Pyrenees and launched systematic assaults on Silingi strongholds in Baetica. This campaign showcased the military dominance that the Visigoths had attained through their fusion with Roman military frameworks. Archaeological discoveries from battle sites near Cordoba exposed the remnants of Silingi defensive positions that were methodically overwhelmed through coordinated infantry attacks and cavalry exploitation tactics that the Vandals proved powerless to counter effectively. The annihilation of Silingi military strength proceeded with brutal efficiency as Visigothic armies exploited their superiority in mobility, logistics, and tactical coordination. The Silingi, despite their numerical advantage and intimate knowledge of local geography, found themselves incapable of concentrating adequate forces to withstand Visigothic advances. Archaeological evidence from numerous sites across Baetica demonstrates the systematic demolition of Silingi fortifications and the evacuation of settlements that had been founded during the initial conquest of the territory. Here's where the story takes a tragic turn. The destiny of King Fredball and the Selimagi royal command remains mysterious from contemporary sources, though archaeological findings suggest that organized Selimagi resistance crumbled rapidly once their primary military units were crushed. Weapon caches from locations linked to the final Selimagi resistance show signs of hasty burial, indicating that surviving warriors attempted to preserve their weapons for future deployment rather than surrendering them to Visigothic armies. However, the absence of subsequent Selimagi activity in the archaeological record reveals that these aspirations proved worthless. The survivors of the Silingi catastrophe faced a brutal choice between submission to Visigothic rule or escape to territories controlled by their Hastingi relatives in Galicia. Archaeological evidence indicates that substantial numbers selected the latter option, with material culture collections from Galician sites during the late 410 CEs displaying increased diversity that reflects the absorption of refugees from Baetica. This population influx supplied the Hastingi with additional military personnel while simultaneously creating logistical obstacles and supporting larger numbers of dependents. But wait, it gets worse. The Alani Confederation, which had established itself in Lusitania and Carthaginensis, suffered similar devastation at Visigothic hands during the same time frame. The destruction of Alani military power proceeded even more swiftly than the elimination of the Seleniae, as the nomadic Alani proved less capable of adapting to defensive warfare in fixed positions. Archaeological evidence from Alani sites reveals widespread abandonment during the late 410s, with characteristic nomadic material culture vanishing from the archaeological record across most of Hispania. The remnants of the Alani Confederation, reduced to a fraction of their former strength, sought sanctuary with the Hastingi Vandals in Galicia, rather than attempting to maintain independent resistance against Visigothic expansion. This decision reflected both practical military considerations and the existing alliance relationships that had connected the Alani to the Vandal Confederation since their migration from Central Europe. Now here's where things get interesting again. The integration of Alani survivors into Hastingi military structure provided crucial cavalry expertise while reinforcing the multicultural character of the surviving Vandal kingdom. The absorption of Alani military traditions into Hastingi forces marked a significant evolution in Vandal military capabilities. The nomadic expertise of the Alani in horse breeding, cavalry tactics, and rapid movement complemented Germanic strengths in infantry combat and siege warfare. Archaeological evidence from military installations in Galicia during the 420s shows the construction of facilities for maintaining large numbers of horses, indicating the increased importance of cavalry and Vandal military organization. The concentration of surviving barbarian forces in Galicia under Hastingi leadership created a formidable military power that proved capable of resisting Visigothic expansion. But here's the real game changer that would reshape history. The maritime expansion that would ultimately define Vandal historical significance began during this period of territorial consolidation in Galicia. The Atlantic coastline of their kingdom provided access to naval resources and shipbuilding expertise that had been absent during their previous continental campaigns. The first Vandal naval raids against Roman territories in the Western Mediterranean represented a dramatic expansion of barbarian military capabilities beyond traditional land-based operations. And then came the moment that would change everything. The consolidation of Vandal power in Galicia under Hastingi leadership created the foundation for one of the most audacious military enterprises in late antique history. King Gunderic's death in 428 CE brought his half-brother Genseric to the throne. A ruler whose strategic vision would transform the Vandals from a regional power confined to northwestern Hispania into masters of the Western Mediterranean. Genseric's rise marked a fundamental shift in Vandal political organization, as the new king systematically centralized authority while eliminating potential rivals within the Confederation's complex leadership structure. Archaeological evidence from royal sites in Galicia during the late 420s reveals extensive construction projects that reflect Genseric's consolidation of power, setting the stage for the incredible maritime empire that was about to emerge. At Bar Augusta, excavations have revealed the remains of an impressive throne hall constructed in a revolutionary architectural style that merged Germanic timber building with Roman stone masonry and ornamental features. The structure's design accommodated both traditional Vandal assemblies and formal Roman-style audiences, revealing Genseric's plan to govern through a blend of Germanic consensus building and imperial administrative techniques. The new ruler's approach to military structure displayed remarkable comprehension of the strategic demands confronting the Vandal kingdom. The survivors of the Seleucid catastrophe and the remnants of the Alani Confederation had supplied additional personnel, but the integration demanded careful management to prevent internal disputes that could compromise Vandal military effectiveness. Genseric implemented a methodical reorganization that dispersed former Seleucid and Alani warriors throughout existing Hastingi military formations, creating combined units that merged different tactical traditions while ensuring devotion to royal command. But here's where Genseric's genius really shows. The maritime capabilities that the Vandals had begun cultivating during their consolidation in Gallia expanded dramatically under Genseric's leadership. Archaeological excavations at shipbuilding locations along the Atlantic coast expose evidence of intensive construction activity during the late 420s, with facilities enlarged to accommodate the production of larger vessels capable of extended ocean journeys. The ships themselves represented technological breakthroughs that combined Germanic construction methods with Roman naval engineering and Atlantic maritime traditions preserved among the Hispano-Roman population of Gallia. Genseric's strategic evaluation of the Vandal kingdom's situation exposed both opportunities and limitations that would influence his subsequent choices. The mountainous geography of Galicia offered excellent defensive benefits against land-based assaults, but the territory's restricted agricultural capacity could not indefinitely sustain the large population that had gathered there, following the destruction of the Silingi and Alani kingdoms. The Visigothic presence in southern Hispania prevented territorial expansion within the peninsula, while the continuing strength of Roman naval power in the Mediterranean constrained the scope of profitable raiding expeditions. However, the intelligence networks that Genseric had inherited from his predecessor provided essential information about conditions throughout the western Mediterranean that revealed unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion. And then came the opportunity of a lifetime. Roman North Africa, the wealthy province that supplied grain to feed the population of Rome itself, had become entangled in a complex civil conflict that had weakened imperial defences and created potential openings for external intervention. The rebellion of Bonifacius, the Comes Africa, who controlled military forces throughout the region against the imperial government, had created a situation that a skilled opportunist might exploit to devastating effect. The decision to invade Roman Africa represented a calculated strategic gamble based on careful analysis of military capabilities, logistical requirements, and potential rewards. Unlike the earlier Vandal migrations, which had been driven by external pressure and immediate survival needs, the African expedition reflected deliberate planning designed to achieve specific political and economic objectives. Archaeological evidence from Galician military sites during the months preceding the invasion shows intensive preparation activities, including the stockpiling of weapons, the construction of transport vessels, and the organization of supply systems capable of supporting large-scale overseas operations. Now here's where things get absolutely incredible. The crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar in May 429 CE involved approximately 80,000 people, representing one of the largest barbarian migrations in recorded history. This massive movement included not only Vandal and Ali warriors, but also their families, dependents, and the accumulated possessions of entire tribal communities. The logistical complexity of transporting such numbers across the Mediterranean required unprecedented organizational capabilities and demonstrated the sophisticated administrative systems that Genseric had developed during his consolidation of power in Hispania. The fleet that carried the Vandal Confederation to Africa consisted of hundreds of vessels ranging from large transport ships capable of carrying entire family groups with their livestock and possessions, to smaller, more maneuverable craft designed for reconnaissance and coastal operations. Archaeological evidence from shipwreck sites in the western Mediterranean includes vessels with construction characteristics consistent with Vandal shipbuilding techniques, providing physical evidence for the scale and sophistication of the maritime operation. The landing sites chosen for the initial invasion reflected careful reconnaissance and strategic planning that took advantage of weaknesses in Roman coastal defences. The immediate Roman response to the Vandal landing demonstrated the weakness of imperial defences in North Africa, and the extent to which the civil conflict involving Bonifacius had disrupted normal military operations. Local garrison forces, already stretched thin by the demands of the ongoing revolt, proved incapable of mounting effective resistance against the massive barbarian invasion force. Contemporary sources describe panic among Roman administrators and civilian populations as news of the Vandal landing spread throughout the province, with many officials abandoning their posts and wealthy civilians attempting to evacuate their portable possessions to supposedly safer locations. The systematic conquest of Roman North Africa proceeded with remarkable efficiency as Vandal forces exploited their advantages in mobility, numbers, and tactical coordination. The Confederation's military organization, refined through decades of migration and warfare, proved ideally suited to the requirements of rapid territorial expansion across the North African coastal plain. And then came the ultimate test. The siege of Hippo Regius in 430 CE marked a crucial examination of Vandal military capabilities against a major Roman fortified position. This city, located on the Mediterranean coast in modern Algeria, served as an important administrative and commercial center, with substantial defensive works and a garrison reinforced by local militia units. The siege demonstrated the sophisticated siege techniques that the Vandals had mastered during their campaigns in Gaul and Hispania, blending traditional Germanic assault methods with Roman engineering principles and equipment seized during their conquest of the region. Archaeological excavations around Hippo Regius have uncovered extensive evidence of the siege operations, including the remnants of Vandal siege works, weapon caches, and temporary fortifications built during the prolonged investment of the city. But here's where this siege becomes historically monumental. The death of Augustine of Hippo during the siege in August 430 CE provided the event with symbolic significance that extended far beyond its immediate military importance. Augustine, whose theological writings had profoundly shaped Christian thought throughout the Roman world, had spent his final months organizing the spiritual defense of his city while Vandal forces tightened their siege lines around its walls. His death marked not only the end of one of Christianity's most influential thinkers, but also symbolized the broader transformation of the Roman world as barbarian kingdoms replaced imperial administration across vast territories. It was literally the end of an era. The fall of Hippo Regius, after a siege lasting over a year, demonstrated both Vandal persistence and the ultimate weakness of Roman defensive capabilities in North Africa. The city's capture provided the Confederation with a major port facility and substantial quantities of military equipment, supplies, and treasure that had been accumulated during the siege. Archaeological evidence from the post-siege occupation phases shows systematic Vandal reorganization of the city's infrastructure, with Roman administrative buildings converted to barbarian purposes while maintaining the essential commercial and manufacturing facilities that made the city economically valuable. Now here's where Genseric's strategic brilliance really becomes apparent. The Vandal approach to governing conquered territories in North Africa reflected lessons learned during their earlier experiences in Hispania, but adapted to the different conditions and opportunities available in the African provinces. Unlike the mountainous terrain of Galicia, which had favored defensive strategies and limited territorial expansion, the coastal plains of North Africa offered opportunities for extensive conquest while providing access to the wealthy trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world. The region's agricultural productivity, based on extensive grain cultivation and olive production, could support much larger populations than the Vandals had been able to maintain in Hispania. The systematic exploitation of Roman administrative infrastructure allowed the Vandals to maintain effective control over their rapidly expanding territories, while preserving the economic systems that made the region valuable. This pragmatic approach to governance demonstrated Genseric's understanding that successful territorial expansion required more than military conquest. It demanded the preservation and adaptation of existing institutional structures. But here's where the Vandals truly revolutionized barbarian warfare. The naval expansion that accompanied Vandal territorial conquest in North Africa transformed the Confederation from a land-based Germanic kingdom into a major Mediterranean maritime power. The capture of Roman naval facilities, shipyards, and technical personnel provided the resources necessary for constructing fleets capable of challenging imperial control of sea routes throughout the Western Mediterranean. Archaeological excavations at ports like Hippo Regius and Rusticade have revealed evidence of extensive shipbuilding activities during the early period of Vandal rule, with facilities expanded and modified to accommodate the production of both military vessels and commercial ships. The development of Vandal naval capabilities proceeded through systematic acquisition of Roman maritime technology combined with innovations based on their own cultural traditions and strategic requirements. Archaeological evidence from rural sites throughout Vandal-controlled North Africa reveals the complex process through which barbarian settlement patterns were integrated with existing Roman agricultural systems. Villa estates show evidence of continued operation under new ownership arrangements, with Roman agricultural techniques maintained while Germanic settlement patterns were superimposed on existing land use systems. And then came the ultimate prize. The capture of Carthage in 439 CE represented the culmination of a decade of systematic conquest that had transformed the Vandals from refugees in Hispania into masters of one of the Mediterranean world's most strategically important regions. The ancient city, which had served as the capital of Roman Africa and one of the empire's largest urban centers, possessed symbolic significance that extended far beyond its immediate military and economic value. This was the moment when a Germanic tribe became a Mediterranean superpower, setting the stage for confrontations that would reshape the entire Roman world. Its fall to barbarian forces marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power throughout the Western Mediterranean, and demonstrated the extent to which traditional Roman dominance had been undermined by the success of Germanic kingdoms. But here's where Ganseric's true genius becomes apparent. The administrative challenge of governing this vast new kingdom required unprecedented organizational sophistication. Ganseric inherited not only Carthage's physical infrastructure, but also its complex bureaucratic systems, which had evolved over centuries to manage the collection of taxes, the administration of justice, and the coordination of military operations across North Africa's diverse territories. Rather than dismantling these Roman institutions, the Vandal king demonstrated remarkable pragmatism by adapting them to serve his own political objectives while preserving their essential functions. This wasn't just smartness, it was revolutionary for a barbarian kingdom. The fusion of Germanic and Roman administrative traditions created a unique governmental system that reflected the multicultural nature of Ganseric's kingdom. At the highest levels, traditional Vandal royal authority remained paramount, with Genseric exercising personal control over major policy decisions and military appointments. However, the day-to-day administration of the kingdom relied heavily on Roman bureaucratic procedures, legal frameworks, and record-keeping systems that had proven their effectiveness over centuries of imperial rule. Archaeological excavations at the royal palace complex in Carthage reveal the physical manifestation of this administrative synthesis. The Vandals converted existing Roman governmental buildings to serve their own purposes, but with modifications that reflected Germanic political traditions and ceremonial requirements. The former proconsular palace shows evidence of extensive renovation during the early years of Vandal rule, with the addition of a great hall designed to accommodate traditional Germanic assemblies alongside existing Roman audience chambers and administrative offices. The personnel who staffed this hybrid administration came from diverse backgrounds that reflected the kingdom's complex ethnic composition. Roman administrators who had served the imperial government found opportunities for continued employment under Vandal authority, though their positions now depended on demonstrating loyalty to Germanic rather than imperial interests. Many of these officials possessed specialized knowledge of taxation systems, legal procedures, and commercial regulations that proved invaluable for maintaining the economic foundations of the kingdom. Germanic nobles, primarily from the Hastingi royal clan and allied families, occupied the highest positions within the administrative hierarchy. These appointments reflected traditional Vandal concepts of political authority based on personal loyalty and kinship ties. But the appointees increasingly found themselves compelled to master Roman administrative techniques to function effectively in their new roles. The result was a gradual Romanization of Vandal elite culture, as Germanic nobles adopted Latin literacy, Roman legal concepts, and imperial ceremonial practices. It was a complete cultural transformation happening in real time. The integration of Alani survivors into the administrative system provided additional complexity to an already diverse governmental structure. The Alani brought their own traditions of nomadic leadership and tribal organization, which had to be reconciled with both Germanic and Roman institutional frameworks. Archaeological evidence suggests that Alani nobles received significant administrative responsibilities, particularly in areas related to cavalry organization and frontier defense where their traditional expertise remained valuable. Now here's where things get really interesting. The legal system that emerged under Vandal rule reflected this multicultural administrative approach through the maintenance of parallel legal traditions for different population groups. Roman law continued to govern most civil disputes involving the indigenous North African population, ensuring continuity in commercial relationships, property rights, and family matters that affected the majority of the kingdom's inhabitants. This pragmatic decision preserved social stability while avoiding the massive disruption that would have resulted from imposing Germanic legal traditions on populations unfamiliar with their procedures and concepts. Meanwhile, Germanic customary law remained the governing framework for disputes within the Vandal community itself, particularly those involving military service, clan relationships, and questions of honor that were central to traditional barbarian society. The royal court maintained specialists in both legal traditions, with Roman-trained jurists handling cases involving imperial law, while Germanic law speakers addressed matters governed by traditional tribal customs. This dual system required careful coordination to prevent conflicts between different legal jurisdictions, particularly in cases involving individuals from different ethnic communities. But here's where Genseric's policies became truly controversial. The most complex legal challenges arose in cases involving religious disputes, where traditional Germanic concepts of royal authority conflicted with both Roman legal precedents and Christian ecclesiastical law. Genseric's approach to these conflicts revealed his broader strategy for managing the religious diversity of his kingdom, while advancing his own political objectives through systematic promotion of Arian Christianity. The religious policies implemented by Genseric represented one of the most controversial aspects of Vandal rule, creating lasting tensions that would influence the kingdom's development throughout its existence. The Vandals had converted to Arian Christianity during their migration through the Danube region, adopting a theological position that denied the full divinity of Christ and rejected the Trinitarian doctrine that had been established as orthodox at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. This religious commitment became intertwined with Vandal ethnic identity and political independence, creating a situation where religious and political loyalty reinforced each other. The promotion of Arian Christianity served multiple political functions within Genseric's kingdom. It provided a unifying ideology for the diverse Germanic and Alani populations that comprised the Vandal Confederation, creating shared religious practices that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. The distinctive theological positions of Arianism also served to differentiate Vandal religious identity from that of the Roman Empire, reinforcing the political independence of the kingdom while providing justification for resistance to imperial authority. By attacking the organizational structure of the Nicene Church, Genseric simultaneously advanced his religious objectives and eliminated potential sources of political opposition. The methods employed in this persecution varied considerably depending on local circumstances and the degree of resistance encountered. In some areas, Vandal authorities simply confiscated church properties and expelled Orthodox clergy, transferring ecclesiastical resources to Arian priests and congregations. Archaeological evidence from church sites throughout North Africa shows systematic conversion of Orthodox religious buildings to Arian use, with modifications to architectural features and decorative programs that reflected the new theological orientation. More severe persecution occurred in regions where Orthodox resistance proved particularly stubborn or where local bishops actively opposed Vandal authority. This religious conflict would define much of the kingdom's internal struggles and its relationships with the broader Christian world. The crews manning these revolutionary Vandal warships created something the Mediterranean had never witnessed before: a fusion of cultures that turned naval warfare into an art form. Picture Roman naval officers, men who possessed decades of essential technical knowledge about Mediterranean sailing conditions, wind patterns, and combat tactics, now finding themselves serving under Germanic commanders who brought an entirely different approach to warfare. These weren't your typical employment arrangements. The Germanic command structures that governed Vandal naval operations emphasized something that Roman military tradition had largely abandoned: personal loyalty and shared participation in the profits of successful expeditions. This wasn't just about following orders and collecting wages. Every sailor, every officer, every warrior aboard these ships had a personal stake in their mission's success. Germanic warriors who had spent their entire lives fighting on land suddenly found themselves adapting to naval service, bringing their traditional military values to sea warfare in ways that created something completely unprecedented. They took their concepts of honor, loyalty, and warrior brotherhood and applied them to the challenges of maritime combat, forging a unique maritime culture that combined barbarian warrior ethos with professional naval expertise. The result was devastating for Roman interests. These weren't just ships. They were floating communities of warriors united by shared purpose and mutual profit, making them incredibly effective in both combat and long-term operations. But Genseric's genius wasn't just in building ships and training crews, it was in understanding exactly where to deploy these forces for maximum strategic impact. The strategic deployment of Vandal naval forces focused on establishing control over key islands and sea routes that would maximize the kingdom's ability to disrupt Roman commerce, while simultaneously protecting its own territorial interests. The conquest of Sardinia represented a masterpiece of strategic thinking. This wasn't just about adding territory to the Vandal kingdom. It provided them with a forward base for operations against the Italian mainland, while demonstrating their ability to project power across vast distances of open ocean. Meanwhile, control of Corsica secured the crucial sea routes connecting North Africa with southern Gaul and Hispania, effectively choking off Roman supply lines. The successful conquest involved systematic reduction of Roman strongholds, establishment of complex supply lines across hundreds of miles of treacherous open ocean, and integration of local populations into Vandal administrative systems. Archaeological teams working at Vandal sites on Sardinia have uncovered evidence revealing the sophisticated methods employed to consolidate control over conquered territory. Existing Roman fortifications weren't simply occupied, they were methodically modified and expanded to serve Vandal defensive requirements. New installations were constructed at strategic locations chosen specifically to control key harbours and mountain passes. Sardinia's position in the central Mediterranean transformed it into an ideal base for launching raids against Roman territories, while providing a secure refuge for Vandal fleets during extended operations. The conquest of the Balearic Islands extended Vandal control over the western Mediterranean's most crucial sea routes, effectively severing Roman communications between Hispania and North Africa, while providing additional bases for raiding operations against Spanish and Gallic coasts. These islands had served as essential waypoints for Roman commercial and military shipping, and their loss to Vandal forces represented a catastrophic strategic defeat for imperial authorities. Governing these island territories required innovations in administrative systems that had been developed in North Africa. Island populations were smaller and more scattered than continental territories, while their economies depended primarily on maritime activities rather than the agricultural production that dominated North African society. Vandal administrators developed specialized governing approaches that reflected these unique characteristics while maintaining political unity within the expanding kingdom. All of this expansion and development was building towards something unprecedented in ancient warfare, the audacious raid on Rome itself in 455 CE. This operation demonstrated both the incredible strategic reach of Genseric's forces and the sophisticated planning capabilities that had come to characterize Vandal military operations. The political circumstances that made this raid possible reflected the continuing catastrophic weakness of the Western Roman Empire, devastated by internal conflicts, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse that had been building for decades. The assassination of Emperor Valentinian III in March 455 CE created a succession crisis that provided Genseric with exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for to strike directly at the heart of Roman power. The new emperor, Petronius Maximus, was a disaster waiting to happen. He lacked both popular support and military resources adequate to defend against a major Vandal assault. The Vandal fleet that sailed from Carthage toward Rome represented the culmination of decades of naval development and military preparation. Archaeological evidence suggests this expedition involved hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors, along with specialized equipment necessary for conducting siege operations against heavily fortified positions. This wasn't just a raid, it was a full-scale naval invasion that would forever change how the ancient world understood maritime warfare. The Vandal fleet that approached Rome wasn't just an impressive sight, it was a floating testament to everything Genseric had achieved over decades of strategic planning. Picture this massive armada composed of diverse vessels, each designed for specific tactical purposes. This approach via the Tiber River revealed Genseric's sophisticated understanding of geographical and strategic factors that would determine success or failure, rather than following the predictable path of previous barbarian attacks, which involved lengthy siege operations against Rome's massive defensive walls. The Vandals exploited their naval mobility to bypass these formidable land-based defenses entirely. They struck from an unexpected direction that caught Roman defenders completely off guard. This tactical innovation demonstrated the unique advantages that naval supremacy provided to Vandal forces, allowing them to project devastating military power across vast distances while avoiding the prolonged siege warfare that had characterized earlier barbarian attempts against major Roman cities. No more waiting months or years outside massive walls hoping to starve defenders into submission. The Vandals simply sailed around the problem. What happened next reveals Genseric's true genius as both military commander and political strategist. The systematic but carefully restrained nature of the sack that followed demonstrated strategic sophistication that shocked contemporary observers. Unlike earlier barbarian raids that involved widespread destruction and random violence, the Vandal occupation of Rome proceeded according to meticulously planned objectives designed to maximize acquisition of valuable resources while minimizing unnecessary damage to the city's infrastructure and population. This wasn't mindless pillaging. This was precision warfare conducted with surgical efficiency. The selection of targets for systematic looting reflected detailed intelligence about the exact location of Rome's most valuable treasures and strategic resources. Archaeological evidence from excavations in these targeted areas reveals something fascinating. Selective removal of valuable items rather than comprehensive destruction. This indicates that the Vandals possessed specific knowledge about exactly what they sought and precisely where to find it. Someone had done their homework, providing detailed intelligence that made this operation devastatingly effective. The removal of imperial treasures from Rome provided the Vandal kingdom with unprecedented wealth that would finance further military expansion and administrative development for generations to come. The systematic transportation of these massive treasure hoards back to Carthage required careful planning and substantial logistical capabilities that demonstrated the organizational sophistication characterizing Vandal military operations during this period. This wasn't a quick smash-and-grab raid. This was a complex logistical operation involving hundreds of ships and thousands of personnel working in perfect coordination. But perhaps the most strategically brilliant aspect of the entire operation was Genseric's capture of prominent Roman hostages, including members of the imperial family itself. These weren't mere trophies of military success. They were carefully selected diplomatic assets that provided Genseric with valuable leverage he would expertly exploit in subsequent negotiations with Roman authorities. These hostages served multiple critical functions within Vandal strategy, providing security against Roman retaliation, while creating opportunities for political manipulation of imperial succession disputes. The treatment of these captives reflected Genseric's sophisticated understanding of their potential value as diplomatic chess pieces rather than simple prisoners of war. The establishment of Vandal control over the central Mediterranean transformed the political landscape of the late Roman world in ways that extended far beyond mere military conquest. The diplomatic revolution that followed would forever change how Romans understood their place in the world, forcing proud imperial authorities to treat barbarian kings as equals rather than subjects. The first major diplomatic breakthrough emerged from the Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Leo I, who recognized something that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. The Vandal kingdom represented a permanent fixture in Mediterranean politics, not just another temporary barbarian incursion that could be waited out or crushed through traditional military means. The negotiations that followed demonstrated just how dramatically traditional Roman diplomatic superiority had been undermined by barbarian military success. But here's what made Genseric's negotiating position truly devastating. His control of the North African grain supply that had traditionally fed the population of Rome itself. The disruption of this vital food source could create famine conditions in imperial territories, giving the Vandal king leverage that no barbarian ruler had ever possessed before. The economic provisions of the treaties that emerged from these negotiations reflected the fundamental transformation of Mediterranean trade networks that had resulted from Vandal naval supremacy. Roman recognition of Vandal control over North African ports effectively acknowledged barbarian authority over trade routes that had been imperial monopolies for centuries. Think about what this meant. Roman emperors were now forced to officially recognize that barbarian kings controlled commerce that had been the lifeblood of imperial power. The tribute arrangements established through these negotiations completely reversed traditional relationships that had defined Roman-barbarian interactions for generations. Now it was Romans making payments to the Vandal kingdom in exchange for guaranteed access to North African grain supplies, turning centuries of imperial superiority upside down. Barbarian tribes that had once paid tribute to imperial authorities were now collecting tribute from the heirs of Caesar Augustus. The diplomatic correspondence preserved in ecclesiastical archives reveals the complex negotiations involved in managing religious differences between Arian Vandal authorities and Orthodox Roman officials. These documents demonstrate how thoroughly theological disputes had become intertwined with political relationships. As religious orthodoxy served as a marker of political loyalty, within both imperial and barbarian governmental systems. The compromise solutions developed through these negotiations established precedents for religious coexistence that would influence diplomatic arrangements throughout the Mediterranean world for generations to come. This wasn't just about politics. It was about creating entirely new frameworks for how different Christian communities could coexist under barbarian rule. The Eastern Roman Empire's diplomatic approach to the Vandal kingdom reflected different strategic priorities and capabilities compared to their desperate Western counterparts. Archaeological evidence from Constantinople during this period reveals something that shows just how seriously the Byzantines took the Vandal threat. Extensive intelligence gathering activities were directed toward North Africa, including the establishment of commercial networks that provided detailed information about Vandal military capabilities and political developments. The Byzantines weren't just hoping the Vandal problem would go away, they were systematically studying their barbarian opponents to understand exactly what they were dealing with. The marriage negotiations between the Eastern Empire and various barbarian kingdoms during this period revealed how completely dynastic diplomacy had become a crucial tool for managing relationships between Roman and Germanic political entities. But these negotiations required an incredibly delicate balance between the prestige benefits of imperial connections and the practical requirements of maintaining political independence. How do you marry your daughter to a barbarian king while still maintaining that you're superior to barbarian kings? The Vandal kingdom's relationships with other barbarian powers in the Western Mediterranean created additional layers of diplomatic complexity that influenced all negotiations with Roman authorities. The Visigothic kingdom in southern Gaul and Hispania represented both a potential ally and a dangerous rival, as both Germanic powers sought to expand their territorial control at Roman expense, while avoiding direct conflicts with each other that might weaken both kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from frontier regions between Vandal and Visigothic territories shows something remarkable: the construction of specialized diplomatic meeting places and the deposition of valuable gifts associated with treaty negotiations. These weren't crude barbarian war councils around campfires. These were sophisticated diplomatic facilities designed for complex international negotiations. The interactions between Vandal and Visigothic diplomatic representatives revealed just how sophisticated barbarian kingdoms had become in understanding Mediterranean politics by the mid-5th century. These negotiations involved far more than simple territorial boundaries and trade arrangements. They included coordination of military activities against Roman targets and careful division of spoils from successful raids. The diplomatic protocols developed for these inter-barbarian negotiations created something entirely new in ancient politics. They combined Germanic traditions of personal loyalty and sacred oaths with Roman concepts of formal treaty obligations and legal procedures, producing hybrid diplomatic systems that neither culture had developed independently. The Ostrogothic emergence as a major power in the Balkans during the 470s created new diplomatic opportunities and challenges for the Vandal kingdom. Theodoric's forces represented a potential ally against Roman authority, but their territorial ambitions in Italy threatened to disrupt the delicate balance of power that had allowed Vandal naval supremacy to flourish unchallenged. The diplomatic correspondence between Carthage and Ostrogothic courts reveals fascinating attempts to coordinate anti-Roman activities while maintaining the territorial divisions that prevented direct conflicts between barbarian kingdoms. This was diplomatic chess playing on a scale that required incredible sophistication from rulers who had supposedly emerged from primitive tribal societies. But here's where things get really complicated. The involvement of foreign powers in Vandal succession disputes reflected the kingdom's complete integration into the broader diplomatic networks of the late Roman world. Roman authorities desperately attempted to support claimants who appeared more amenable to imperial interests, while other barbarian kingdoms sought to influence Vandal politics to advance their own territorial and commercial objectives. The documentary evidence for these interventions reveals something that would have been unthinkable centuries earlier. Internal barbarian politics had become matters of international concern that could affect the balance of power throughout the Mediterranean world. The religious dimensions of these succession disputes added layers of complexity that made already challenging political situations nearly impossible to resolve. Different claimants to the Vandal throne often represented completely different approaches to religious policy, with some favoring continued brutal persecution of Orthodox Christians, while others advocated for more tolerant policies that might improve relationships with Roman authorities. The resolution of these religious conflicts required an incredibly delicate balance between maintaining Vandal Arian identity and accommodating the diverse religious preferences of the kingdom's multicultural population. How do you remain true to your theological convictions while governing subjects who fundamentally disagree with those convictions? The religious landscape of the Vandal kingdom underwent profound transformation as Arian Christianity became the defining characteristic of barbarian rule in North Africa. The theological dispute that had originated in 4th century Alexandria now served as the cornerstone of Vandal political identity, distinguishing Germanic rulers from their Roman subjects, while providing ideological justification for systematic persecution of Orthodox Christians. The Vandals' commitment to this theological position intensified during their epic migration, as Arian Christianity became inextricably intertwined with ethnic identity and political independence from Roman authority. This wasn't just about religious belief, it was about cultural survival and political legitimacy in a world dominated by Roman Orthodox Christianity. The systematic persecution of Catholic bishops began immediately following the Vandal conquest of major North African cities. In Carthage, the Orthodox bishop Quodvoltius faced immediate exile when Genseric's forces captured the city in 439 CE. Archaeological evidence from the bishop's residence shows hasty abandonment, with valuable manuscripts and liturgical objects left behind during the forced evacuation. The bishop's extensive library, containing centuries of theological writings and administrative records, was systematically transferred to Arian clerical authorities who used these resources to understand and counter orthodox theological arguments. This wasn't random destruction, it was intellectual warfare conducted with surgical precision. The confiscation of Catholic Church properties proceeded according to carefully planned objectives that maximized both economic and political benefits for the Vandal kingdom. Archaeological excavations at these sites reveal the methodical removal of Orthodox religious imagery and its replacement with Arian theological symbols, including modified representations of Christ that emphasized his subordinate relationship to God the Father. Every detail was designed to reinforce the theological message that defined Vandal political identity. The exile of Catholic bishops created a diaspora of Orthodox religious leaders, who maintained networks of resistance and communication throughout the Mediterranean world. These exiled clergy found refuge in various locations, from the Eastern Roman Empire to remote monastic communities in Egypt and Syria, where they continued writing theological treatises condemning Vandal religious policies, while organizing support for their persecuted congregations. These theological training institutions produced something unprecedented in the ancient world, a generation of clergy capable of conducting religious services in multiple languages, while systematically defending Arian theological positions against Orthodox criticism through intensive study of scriptural texts and patristic writings. Imagine priests who could preach to Germanic warriors in Gothic, conduct business with Roman administrators in Latin, and engage North African congregants in local dialects, all while maintaining sophisticated theological arguments that could hold their ground against centuries of Orthodox Christian scholarship. The liturgical practices developed within Vandal Arian churches reflected the extraordinary synthesis of Germanic and Roman Christian traditions that characterized the kingdom's entire cultural development. The Arian liturgy wasn't simply adopted from existing traditions, it was carefully crafted to incorporate elements from Gothic Christian practices brought by barbarian migrants alongside Latin Christian rituals familiar to the North African population. Archaeological evidence from church sites reveals something fascinating about how deeply theology influenced even architectural design. The construction of new Arian churches throughout the Vandal kingdom demonstrated both the incredible wealth accumulated through decades of conquest and the sophisticated architectural capabilities that had developed under barbarian rule. The massive Arian cathedral constructed in Carthage during the 440 CE represents the pinnacle of this architectural achievement. This wasn't just a building, it was a statement of power that combined Germanic timber construction techniques with Roman stone masonry and North African decorative traditions, creating a distinctive architectural style that had never been seen before. The building's massive scale, with a nave capable of accommodating thousands of worshippers simultaneously, proclaimed the complete triumph of Aryan theology while providing practical facilities for the religious needs of the expanding Germanic population. The artistic styles employed in these decorations created something entirely new in Christian art. Germanic geometric patterns merged with Roman figurative traditions and North African symbolic elements, producing hybrid visual languages that appealed to the kingdom's incredibly diverse population while consistently reinforcing Arian doctrinal positions. But perhaps the most remarkable development was how Vandal court culture evolved through systematic adaptation of Roman imperial ceremonial traditions, modified to accommodate Germanic political values and Arian religious requirements. The royal court at Carthage became a center of cultural synthesis, where barbarian warrior traditions merged with Roman administrative sophistication and Christian theological scholarship. Archaeological evidence from the royal palace complex reveals the construction of audience halls, specifically designed to accommodate both traditional Germanic assemblies and formal Roman-style ceremonies, with architectural features that perfectly reflected this unprecedented cultural fusion. The patronage of arts and literature by Vandal royal authorities created opportunities for cultural development that attracted scholars and artists from throughout the Mediterranean world. The royal library established in Carthage during Genseric's reign combined manuscripts preserved from Roman administrative archives with new works commissioned from contemporary authors. These collections included both religious texts supporting Arian theological positions and secular works covering subjects ranging from military strategy to agricultural techniques, reflecting the practical educational needs of a barbarian kingdom that had evolved far beyond simple tribal organization. The literary productions sponsored by Vandal courts revealed the sophisticated intellectual culture that had developed within the kingdom, despite its reputation for barbarism among Roman contemporaries. These works circulated throughout Arian communities across the Mediterranean world, contributing to theological debates that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Vandal kingdom, establishing barbarian scholars as legitimate participants in the highest levels of Christian intellectual discourse. The educational policies implemented throughout Vandal territories reflected the practical requirements of governing culturally diverse populations, while maintaining Germanic political identity. The preservation of classical learning occurred through pragmatic recognition that Roman educational traditions provided essential skills for administrative and commercial activities. Archaeological evidence from educational facilities reveals the continuation of traditional Roman curricula in grammar, rhetoric, and law, though carefully modified to accommodate Arian theological instruction and Germanic cultural values. Their integration into barbarian governmental structures required the incredibly delicate balance between preserving their technical knowledge and ensuring their loyalty to Germanic political objectives through methods that sometimes pushed the boundaries of what Roman dignity could tolerate. The manuscript production that continued under Vandal rule demonstrated the kingdom's remarkable commitment to preserving classical learning while systematically adapting it to serve contemporary political and religious needs. Scriptoriums established in Carthage and other major centers produced copies of both classical texts and contemporary works, with particular emphasis on materials that supported Arian theological positions or provided practical guidance for administrative activities. The survival of these manuscripts in later medieval libraries reveals the extraordinary extent of intellectual activity that flourished under barbarian patronage, challenging every assumption Romans had made about Germanic cultural capabilities. Archaeological evidence of Vandal material culture reveals the distinctive artistic and technological developments that emerged from this unprecedented fusion of Germanic, Roman, and North African traditions. Pottery production throughout the kingdom combined Germanic decorative motifs with Roman technical methods and local clay sources, creating ceramic styles that perfectly reflected the multicultural nature of Vandal society. Excavations at production sites reveal standardized manufacturing techniques that suggest centralized control over craft production, with quality standards maintained through systematic oversight by royal administrators who understood that cultural products were statements of political legitimacy. The jewelry produced in Vandal workshops demonstrated metalwork techniques so sophisticated they could rival anything produced in Constantinople itself. Germanic Cloisonner work, featuring intricate patterns of colored glass set in gold or silver frameworks, was combined with Roman gem-cutting techniques and North African filigree traditions to create distinctive ornamental styles that had never existed before. Archaeological finds from elite burial sites reveal pieces that rival contemporary Byzantine imperial jewelry in their technical sophistication and artistic achievement, proving that barbarian craftsmen had not only preserved classical techniques, but had actually improved upon them. But perhaps most impressive were the technological innovations developed within the Vandal kingdom that reflected the practical challenges of maintaining maritime supremacy while governing diverse territorial possessions across vast distances. Shipbuilding techniques evolved through systematic combination of Germanic carpentry traditions with Roman naval architecture and North African maritime knowledge, creating vessels optimized for both military operations and commercial activities. Archaeological evidence from shipyard sites reveals the development of standardized construction methods that allowed for efficient production of large numbers of ships, while maintaining consistent quality standards that ensured every vessel could perform reliably in the demanding conditions of Mediterranean warfare and commerce. The agricultural innovations implemented throughout Vandal territories demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between agricultural productivity and political stability that many contemporary rulers completely failed to grasp. Roman farming techniques were preserved and systematically improved through incorporation of Germanic animal husbandry practices and North African irrigation methods, creating hybrid agricultural systems that maximize productivity while accommodating the settlement patterns preferred by barbarian populations. Archaeological evidence from rural sites shows the construction of entirely new types of farm buildings that combined Roman storage facilities with Germanic residential arrangements, reflecting the cultural synthesis that characterized Vandal rural society, and proved that barbarians could improve upon Roman techniques rather than simply copying them. Archaeological evidence from trading posts reveals the systematic organization of these commercial relationships, with standardized weights and measures maintained across the kingdom's territories, while specialized facilities were constructed to accommodate the storage and transportation requirements of different types of goods. The prosperity generated through these commercial activities provided crucial resources for maintaining the military forces and administrative systems that sustained Vandal political control, creating a positive feedback loop that seemed to guarantee permanent success. But then everything changed. The death of Genseric in January 477 CE marked the beginning of a gradual but inexorable decline in Vandal power that would ultimately culminate in the kingdom's complete destruction just 56 years later. The succession system that the Great King had established, carefully designed to prevent civil wars through predetermined inheritance rules, instead created a series of weak rulers who lacked both the personal authority and strategic vision necessary to maintain the complex political structure that Genseric had so masterfully constructed. The new king Huneric inherited vast territories, substantial military forces, and accumulated wealth that would have made him the envy of any ruler in the Mediterranean world. But the very success of his predecessor's conquests had created administrative and military challenges that exceeded the capabilities of his successors, revealing fundamental flaws in the system that had seemed so brilliantly designed. Archaeological evidence from the royal palace in Carthage during this transition period shows extensive modifications to ceremonial spaces, with the construction of new audience halls designed to emphasize the formal legal basis of royal authority, rather than the personal relationships between king and warriors that had characterized traditional Germanic leadership. This was the beginning of the end for the Vandal kingdom, as the very systems designed to ensure its survival would ultimately destroy it from within. But this cultural synthesis that had seemed so promising during Genseric's reign also generated serious tensions between fundamentally different approaches to governance and policy implementation that would prove impossible to reconcile under weaker leadership. The military establishment faced its own devastating internal divisions that reflected the incredibly diverse origins and experiences of the various groups that comprised Vandal armed forces. The traditional Germanic warrior bands maintained their fierce emphasis on personal loyalty and individual combat prowess, but the complex requirements of maintaining territorial control and conducting sophisticated naval operations had necessitated the development of more professional military units with standardized equipment and systematic training that ran counter to everything Germanic warriors valued. These professional forces increasingly found themselves in direct conflict with traditional warriors over crucial resources, prestigious command positions, and fundamental strategic priorities that reflected completely different military philosophies. The integration of Roman military personnel and advanced techniques had created additional layers of complexity within Vandal military organization that proved nearly impossible to manage effectively. Former imperial officers who had entered Vandal service brought in valuable expertise in siege warfare, complex logistics, and large-scale tactical coordination that the kingdom desperately needed for continued success. But their presence generated bitter resentment among Germanic warriors who viewed such technical approaches as fundamentally incompatible with traditional barbarian military values that emphasized individual heroism and personal combat skills over systematic organization and coordinated tactics. Archaeological evidence from military installations throughout the kingdom reveals something that perfectly illustrates these tensions: the construction of completely separate facilities for different types of military units. The substantial profits generated through naval raids and commercial activities provided these forces with economic resources that dramatically reduced their dependence on royal patronage, while their exceptional mobility allowed them to avoid direct supervision by court officials who might attempt to impose unwanted restrictions on their operations. The decline in military effectiveness became painfully apparent during the later years of Huneric's reign as various enemies began testing Vandal defences with increasing boldness and achieving successes that would have been unthinkable during Genseric's era. The Moorish tribes of the North African interior, who had maintained varying degrees of independence throughout the entire period of Vandal expansion, began launching more frequent and dramatically more successful raids against settled territories that revealed fundamental weaknesses in the kingdom's defensive arrangements. These attacks exposed a critical flaw in Vandal military thinking. The traditional Germanic emphasis on aggressive offensive warfare had not adequately prepared their forces for the systematic defense of fixed territories against mobile enemies who understood local conditions far better than their barbarian opponents. Moorish military organization was perfectly suited to exploiting these defensive weaknesses that Germanic military traditions had created. Their forces consisted primarily of light cavalry and infantry units, capable of rapid movement across the desert and mountainous terrain that characterized the interior regions of North Africa. These warriors possessed intimate knowledge of local geography and crucial water sources, allowing them to conduct extended campaigns in areas where Vandal forces struggled to maintain adequate supplies for even short-term operations. Archaeological evidence from frontier sites shows the desperate construction of increasingly elaborate defensive works during this period, indicating Vandal recognition of the growing threat, while simultaneously revealing their complete inability to develop effective countermeasures against enemies who fought according to entirely different principles. The first major Moorish success occurred in 483 CE, when tribal forces under the leadership of a chief named Mastes launched a brilliantly coordinated assault on Vandal positions in the Orez Mountains. The attack demonstrated sophisticated tactical planning that combined traditional Moorish mobility with detailed knowledge of Vandal defensive arrangements gained through careful reconnaissance and systematic intelligence gathering. The battle that followed revealed the devastating extent to which Vandal military capabilities had deteriorated since Genseric's death, as Germanic forces proved completely unable to adapt their tactics to counter the fluid, hit-and-run methods employed by their Moorish opponents who struck like lightning and vanished before effective retaliation could be organized. The defeat had catastrophic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military losses suffered on the battlefield. News of Vandal weakness spread rapidly throughout the North African interior, encouraging other Moorish tribes to launch their own attacks while systematically undermining the military prestige that had been absolutely crucial to maintaining barbarian control over the region's incredibly diverse populations. The psychological impact proved particularly damaging among the Romanized urban populations who had accepted Vandal rule, partly because of barbarian military superiority that now appeared to be crumbling before their eyes. Archaeological evidence from cities throughout the kingdom shows dramatically increased construction of defensive works during this period, indicating civilian recognition that royal forces could no longer guarantee the adequate protection that had been taken for granted during the kingdom's golden age under Genseric's brilliant leadership. The taxation system that had been so carefully adapted from Roman administrative methods became increasingly inefficient as central authority steadily weakened and local officials gained dangerous independence from royal oversight. The complex bureaucratic procedures necessary for effective tax collection required constant supervision and coordination between multiple administrative levels. But the bitter factional divisions within the court made such systematic administration increasingly impossible to maintain. Documentary evidence from this period reveals growing discrepancies between official tax assessments and actual collections, indicating the complete breakdown of administrative control that had been absolutely crucial to maintaining royal revenues during the kingdom's golden age. The succession of Gunthermund in 484 CE brought temporary hope for royal recovery among those who still believed the Vandal kingdom could be saved. But the new king faced challenges that had only intensified and multiplied during his predecessor's disastrous reign. The court factions that had emerged under Homeric had become more deeply entrenched and increasingly hostile to any form of effective royal authority. Meanwhile, external enemies had gained tremendous confidence and enhanced military capability through their earlier successes against weakened Vandal forces. Gunthermund's desperate attempts to restore effective governance required confronting these multiple sources of weakness simultaneously, monumental task that proved completely beyond the capabilities of traditional Germanic political methods that remained the foundation of Vandal royal authority. The religious policies implemented by Gunthermund represented a significant and controversial departure from the systematic persecution that had characterized earlier Vandal rule under Genseric and Huneric. Archaeological evidence from church sites during this period shows the beginning of a gradual restoration of Catholic facilities, with some buildings returned to Orthodox use, while others were ingeniously converted to accommodate both Arian and Catholic services in an unprecedented attempt at religious compromise. This religious moderation created entirely new tensions within the Arian establishment that had become completely accustomed to privileged status and substantial resources under the previous persecution policies. Arian bishops viewed any concessions to Orthodox Christians as direct threats to their own positions and fundamental theological principles, leading to bitter conflicts with royal policy that further divided the court and systematically weakened central authority. The documentary evidence for these religious disputes reveals the devastating extent to which theological differences had become inextricably intertwined with political power struggles within the kingdom, creating conflicts that no ruler could resolve without alienating crucial supporters. The military reforms attempted by Gunthermund focused desperately on addressing the tactical deficiencies that had been so painfully revealed through humiliating defeats at Moorish and Byzantine hands. Archaeological evidence from military installations shows frantic construction of new training facilities and weapons workshops designed to standardize equipment and improve the technical capabilities of royal forces that had proven inadequate against more adaptive enemies. However, these reform efforts faced fierce resistance from traditional military leaders who viewed any changes in established practices as direct threats to their own authority and status within the military hierarchy that had served them so well during the kingdom's expansion period. The Germanic warrior culture that remained absolutely central to Vandal military identity emphasized individual prowess and personal relationships between commanders and followers, concepts that directly conflicted with the systematic training and standardized procedures necessary for effective defensive operations against sophisticated enemies. The tensions generated by these fundamentally conflicting approaches to military organization created additional devastating divisions within the armed forces that further reduced their effectiveness when unity was most desperately needed. The reign of Thrasimund, who succeeded Gunthermund in 496 CE, marked the final phase of independent Vandal rule before the kingdom's ultimate and inevitable collapse. Thrasimund possessed significantly greater personal ability than his immediate predecessors and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the complex strategic challenges facing the kingdom. But the structural weaknesses that had developed over 2 decades of continuous decline proved too extensive and deeply rooted for any individual ruler to overcome, no matter how capable or determined they might be. The marriage alliance negotiated between Thrasimund and Amalafada, sister of the powerful Ostrogothic king Theodoric, represented a desperate attempt to strengthen the Vandal international position through diplomatic means when military solutions had proven inadequate. This arrangement provided theoretical access to Ostrogothic military support while creating family connections that might deter Byzantine aggression against an increasingly vulnerable kingdom. Archaeological evidence from the elaborate wedding celebrations reveals the substantial resources invested in demonstrating continued Vandal wealth and power to international observers. But the underlying weakness of the kingdom made such expensive displays increasingly hollow and ultimately counterproductive, as they revealed the kingdom's desperate need to project strength it no longer possessed. The final years of Thrasimund's reign witnessed accelerating decline in all aspects of Vandal power that had once dominated the Mediterranean. The succession crisis that followed Thrasimund's death in 523 CE revealed the complete breakdown of the political system that Genseric had so carefully established. The predetermined succession rules that had been designed to prevent civil wars instead created a catastrophic situation where multiple claimants possessed theoretical legitimacy, while lacking any practical support from the kingdom's fractured power structure. This was the beginning of the end for the Vandal kingdom that had once terrorized Rome itself. The factional conflicts that resulted from Hilderic's controversial religious policies created something unprecedented in Vandal history: open warfare within the kingdom itself, with different groups controlling separate territories and maintaining completely independent military forces that fought each other with the same ferocity they had once reserved for Roman enemies. The devastating civil war that erupted during Hilderic's reign eliminated any possibility of effective resistance to external threats, while simultaneously providing golden opportunities for enemies to systematically exploit Vandal weakness at the moment when unity was most desperately needed. But what the Vandals didn't realize was that hundreds of miles away in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian was watching their self-destruction with calculated interest, recognizing that this internal chaos presented an unprecedented opportunity for something that had seemed impossible just decades earlier: the complete restoration of imperial control over North Africa. The Byzantine preparations for the reconquest of North Africa proceeded with systematic precision as Emperor Justinian recognized that Vandal internal conflicts had created the perfect storm of conditions for imperial restoration. The extensive intelligence networks that Constantinople had carefully maintained throughout the region provided incredibly detailed information about Vandal military capabilities and political divisions, allowing Byzantine planners to develop comprehensive strategies for what would become one of the most ambitious military campaigns in generations. Archaeological evidence from Byzantine military installations reveals the massive scope of preparations during this period, with new equipment produced according to standardized specifications and forces assembled for the greatest imperial offensive since the days of the early emperors. The intelligence reports reaching Constantinople in early 533 CE painted a picture of Vandal weakness that exceeded even the most optimistic Byzantine assessments. Justinian's sophisticated network of spies, merchants, and diplomatic contacts throughout North Africa provided detailed accounts of the catastrophic civil war raging between Hilderic's supporters and the forces loyal to Gelimer, who had seized the throne in a brutal military coup the previous year. These reports described Vandal armies fragmented into competing factions, strategic fortifications left completely unmanned due to troop deployments for internal conflicts, and a general population increasingly hostile to Germanic rule after decades of religious persecution and systematic economic exploitation. Emperor Justinian's decision to launch the reconquest represented the culmination of years of strategic planning that had actually begun during the later stages of Thrasimund's reign, when Byzantine analysts first recognized that Vandal power was entering terminal decline. The emperor's advisors had systematically analyzed every aspect of Vandal military capabilities, identifying specific weaknesses in their defensive arrangements while developing innovative tactical approaches designed to exploit these vulnerabilities with devastating effectiveness. The selection of Belisarius as commander for the African expedition reflected careful consideration of the specific requirements for conducting operations against the Vandal kingdom. His extensive experience with complex combined land and naval operations made him ideally suited for the enormous logistical challenges involved in projecting imperial power across the Mediterranean, while maintaining effective coordination between different types of military units operating in unfamiliar terrain. The army assembled for the African campaign represented the finest military force that the Eastern Roman Empire had fielded in generations. The elite corps consisted of approximately 15,000 regular troops drawn from the Schola Palatinae and other prestigious units, supplemented by substantial numbers of foederati and allied contingents that brought the total force to nearly 18,000 men. Archaeological evidence from Byzantine military installations reveals the extensive preparations involved in equipping this army, with new weapons produced according to rigorous standardized specifications, while specialized equipment was developed specifically for the unique challenges expected in North African operations. The cavalry component of Belisarius's army reflected the tactical innovations that had completely transformed Byzantine military capabilities during the early 6th century. The naval component of the expedition consisted of approximately 500 vessels of various types, from massive transport ships capable of carrying entire cavalry units with their horses to smaller, nimble warships designed for reconnaissance and coastal operations. The departure of this massive force from Constantinople in June 533 CE represented one of the largest military expeditions launched by the Eastern Roman Empire in living memory. Contemporary sources describe the awe-inspiring sight of hundreds of ships stretching across the horizon, their sails bearing the imperial eagle, while their hulls carried the hopes of imperial restoration. The initial landing at Caput Vada, approximately 150 miles south of Carthage, caught Vandal forces completely unprepared for the scale and coordination of the Byzantine assault. Gelimer had concentrated his available troops for operations against internal enemies, leaving the coastline defended by scattered garrison units that proved utterly incapable of mounting effective resistance against Belisarius's professional army. The Battle of Ad Decimum, fought on September 13, 533 CE, revealed the devastating extent to which Vandal military capabilities had deteriorated since the days of Genseric's conquests. Gelimer's forces, hastily assembled from various garrison units and tribal contingents, completely lacked the coordination and tactical flexibility that had characterized earlier Vandal armies. The king's desperate battle plan relied entirely on traditional Germanic tactics, involving massive frontal assaults by densely packed infantry formations, approaches that would prove disastrously ineffective against the sophisticated Byzantine combined arms tactics that integrated cavalry, infantry, and archery units in precisely coordinated tactical systems that had been perfected through decades of professional warfare. The disciplined infantry units were strategically positioned on the flanks where their rock-solid formations could provide crucial stability, while expertly exploiting any gaps created by cavalry operations that shattered Vandal lines. The initial phase of the battle saw Vandal cavalry units desperately attempt to disrupt Byzantine formations through traditional barbarian shock tactics that had once terrorized Roman armies. These attacks achieved some limited initial success against isolated Byzantine units, but the overall coordination of imperial forces prevented any decisive breakthrough that might have turned the tide. The Vandal horsemen found themselves subjected to sustained archery fire that inflicted horrific casualties while preventing them from maintaining the momentum absolutely necessary for effective cavalry operations against disciplined opponents. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield includes numerous arrowheads of distinctive Byzantine manufacture, providing stark testimony to the incredible volume of missile fire that imperial archers directed against their increasingly desperate opponents throughout the engagement. The decisive moment that would end the Vandal kingdom forever came when Belisarius personally led a devastating cavalry charge that completely shattered the center of the Vandal formation like a hammer blow. The Byzantine general's tactical timing proved absolutely perfect, as his attack coincided precisely with the collapse of Vandal morale following the deaths of several prominent nobles in the earlier fighting. The relentless pursuit that followed demonstrated the decisive mobility advantages that Byzantine forces possessed over their completely demoralized opponents. Imperial cavalry maintained constant contact with retreating Vandal units, inflicting additional casualties while systematically preventing any attempt to establish defensive positions that might allow for reorganization. The systematic nature of this pursuit reflected the professional training that characterized Belisarius's army, with different units assigned specific roles in maintaining crushing pressure on the enemy, while avoiding the disorganization that often affected pursuing forces in less disciplined armies. Gelimer's panicked decision to abandon Carthage rather than attempting a siege defense revealed his devastating recognition that Vandal military power had been effectively destroyed in a single catastrophic battle. The king's hasty evacuation of the capital proceeded in such desperate haste that substantial quantities of royal treasure and military equipment were left behind, providing Belisarius with valuable resources while demonstrating the completeness of the Vandal collapse. Archaeological excavations in Carthage have uncovered hordes of coins and precious objects that were frantically buried during this period, indicating the absolute panic that gripped the city's population as news of the military disaster spread through the streets. The Byzantine entry into Carthage on September 15, 533 CE, marked the definitive end of nearly a century of Vandal rule in North Africa. The city's population, which had suffered under decades of brutal Arian persecution and Germanic exploitation, welcomed the imperial forces as liberators rather than conquerors. Contemporary sources describe joyous celebrations in the streets as Orthodox Christian churches were triumphantly reopened and exiled bishops returned to their rightful seats, after years of forced exile under barbarian rule. But Gelimer wasn't finished yet. The Battle of Tricamarum, fought in December 533 CE, eliminated the last organized Vandal resistance under the fallen king's desperate leadership. Gelimer had managed to assemble approximately 5,000 warriors from scattered tribal groups and loyal garrison units, but this force utterly lacked the training, equipment, and coordination necessary to challenge Belisarius's professional army. The battle demonstrated exactly the same tactical patterns that had characterized the earlier engagement at Adodecimum, with Byzantine combined arms tactics proving decisively superior to traditional Germanic military methods that belonged to a bygone era. However, these defensive advantages proved utterly inadequate against the tactical flexibility and professional coordination that characterized imperial military operations under Belisarius's brilliant leadership. The battle's outcome was determined by the superior morale and training of Byzantine forces, rather than by any particular tactical innovation. The Vandal warriors, completely demoralized by their earlier defeat and lacking any confidence in their leadership, proved unable to maintain cohesion under the sustained pressure of imperial attacks. The collapse of organized resistance occurred even more rapidly than at Adodecimum, with many Vandal units abandoning their positions before sustaining significant casualties, effectively ending any hope of Vandal recovery. The capture of Gelimer's family and treasury during the pursuit that followed Tricamarum eliminated any possibility of continued Vandal resistance. The king himself managed to escape to the mountainous regions of the interior, where he sought refuge among Moorish tribes that had maintained their independence throughout the entire period of Germanic rule. However, his complete isolation from the remaining elements of Vandal society and his lack of resources for maintaining military operations made continued resistance absolutely impossible. The siege of Mount Papua, where Gelimer had taken his final refuge, lasted through the bitter winter of 533-534 CE, and demonstrated the thoroughness with which Byzantine forces pursued the complete elimination of Vandal political authority from North Africa forever. The fate awaiting the Vandal people after their empire's collapse wasn't uniform at all. Your destiny depended entirely on who you were and how deeply you'd been involved with the old Germanic system. The royal family and top nobles got the full Roman treatment paraded through Constantinople in chains for Justinian's victory celebration. Being surprisingly given land grants in Anatolia, this wasn't random cruelty followed by mercy. This was calculated Roman political theatre that had been perfected over centuries of dealing with defeated barbarian leaders. The ordinary Vandal warriors faced a completely different reality that would reshape their entire existence. These battle-hardened Germanic fighters were presented with a stark choice: join the Byzantine army or face deportation to remote frontier territories where their combat skills could serve imperial defense needs. What's absolutely fascinating is how many chose to stay and fight, but now for their former enemies. These same Vandal units that had once terrorized Roman territories were soon marching alongside Byzantine forces against other barbarian tribes and Persian armies in the east. The transformation of former Vandal lands into Byzantine provinces followed a blueprint that had been refined through generations of imperial expansion. The old prefecture of Africa rose from the ashes, with Carthage once again serving as its beating heart. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Byzantines didn't just rebuild, they completely reimagined the entire region. Archaeological discoveries tell an incredible story of systematic destruction and reconstruction. Germanic fortifications were either torn down completely or gutted and rebuilt to serve Roman purposes. This wasn't just about changing flags or switching rulers. The Byzantines were literally erasing the physical evidence of Vandal rule while constructing a new imperial reality. Roman government buildings expanded across the landscape, while Germanic structures vanished like they'd never existed. It was cultural replacement on an industrial scale, executed with the precision that only centuries of imperial experience could provide. The religious revolution that swept through North Africa happened with breathtaking speed and thoroughness. Arian churches that had served the Vandal kingdom were systematically converted to Orthodox use through careful architectural modifications and completely new decorative programs. Meanwhile, brand new Catholic churches sprouted across the region to serve the spiritual needs of the restored imperial population. The Arian clergy who administered to the Germanic kingdom faced a brutal choice: convert to Orthodox Christianity or face exile. Most chose accommodation over continued resistance, recognizing that their old world was truly dead. But perhaps the most ruthless aspect of Byzantine policy was their systematic deportation of Vandal populations across the empire. This wasn't random relocation. It was calculated cultural genocide designed to prevent any future Germanic political organization in North Africa. These population transfers scattered former Vandal communities across vastly different regions and cultural contexts, making it impossible for them to maintain their distinct ethnic identity or political traditions. Within just one generation, most descendants of the Vandal warriors who had conquered North Africa under Genseric had become completely indistinguishable from the broader populations where they'd been resettled. The disappearance of Vandal identity over subsequent generations reveals both the ruthless efficiency of Byzantine integration policies and the profound changes that had already occurred within Germanic society during their century of North African rule. The Romanization that had transformed Vandal elite culture during their period of dominance actually made their absorption into imperial society much easier. The religious conversion from Arianism to Orthodox Christianity eliminated one of the primary markers that had distinguished Germanic peoples from their Roman subjects. Yet the historical impact of the Vandal kingdom extended far beyond their century of political dominance in North Africa. Their success in establishing a functioning barbarian state within former Roman territories provided a blueprint that influenced Germanic kingdoms throughout Western Europe. The administrative techniques, military innovations, and diplomatic practices that had characterized Vandal rule were studied and adapted by other barbarian leaders facing similar challenges in governing diverse populations, while maintaining their ethnic identity and political independence. The transformation of Mediterranean politics that resulted from Vandal naval supremacy had permanent consequences that outlasted their kingdom's destruction. The development of barbarian maritime capabilities proved that Germanic peoples could master complex technologies and organizational methods necessary for projecting power across vast distances. This fundamentally altered Roman assumptions about barbarian limitations and capabilities, encouraging other Germanic groups to develop their own naval forces while providing practical examples of effective maritime organization. The final collapse of the Vandal kingdom in 534 CE marked the end of one of the most successful barbarian attempts to create a functioning state within former Roman boundaries. Their century of rule in North Africa had demonstrated both the incredible possibilities and ultimate limitations of Germanic political adaptation to Mediterranean conditions, leaving lessons that would echo through European history for centuries to come. But here's the most mind-blowing part of this entire story. While their crushing defeat showed that imperial organization and resources still held decisive advantages over barbarian opponents, what happened to the Vandals as a people reveals something even more extraordinary. The completeness of their disappearance as a distinct culture within just a few generations of their political collapse demonstrates the absolutely terrifying assimilative power of imperial society when it's backed by systematic government policies and overwhelming military dominance. Think about this for a moment. An entire nation of warriors who had conquered and ruled one of the richest regions of the ancient world for over a century simply vanished. Not through genocide or mass slaughter, but through something far more subtle and perhaps more devastating: complete cultural absorption. The Roman Empire had perfected the art of making entire peoples disappear by making them Roman. The Vandal experience represents one of the most crucial chapters in understanding how the ancient world transformed from imperial unity into the fragmented political landscape that would define medieval Europe. Their temporary success in challenging Roman authority didn't just create political chaos, it permanently altered the entire structure of Mediterranean politics. They proved that barbarian kingdoms could function, that Germanic peoples could master complex technologies like naval warfare, and that Roman dominance wasn't inevitable. Yet their ultimate failure tells an even more compelling story about the incredible resilience of imperial institutions and the enduring magnetic appeal of Roman civilization among diverse populations throughout the former empire. Even after centuries of decline, even after being pushed to the brink of extinction, the Roman system possessed something that barbarian kingdoms simply couldn't match: the ability to absorb, transform, and ultimately outlast their conquerors. The irony is staggering when you really consider it. The Vandals conquered Roman territory, adopted Roman administrative practices, embraced Roman luxury, and even began speaking Latin. In trying to replace Rome, they became Roman, and when the real Romans returned with Byzantine armies, the cultural transformation was already so complete that resistance became almost impossible. The Vandals had conquered themselves through their own success. This pattern would echo throughout European history for centuries to come. The Vandal kingdom's rise and fall became a template that other barbarian leaders studied, adapted, and ultimately repeated. Their innovations in naval warfare, their diplomatic strategies, their attempts to balance Germanic identity with Roman administrative efficiency, all of these became part of a broader Germanic playbook for ruling former Roman territories. But perhaps most importantly, their story reveals the fundamental tension that would define the entire medieval period. The struggle between tribal identity and imperial civilization, between barbarian independence and Roman order, between the desire to conquer Rome and the inevitable fate of becoming Roman. The Vandals didn't just lose a war, they lost themselves in the process of trying to replace what they had conquered. The final collapse of the Vandal kingdom in 534 CE wasn't just the end of one barbarian state, it was the last gasp of an entire approach to post-Roman politics. The final demonstration that no matter how successful barbarian kingdoms might become, they could never truly escape the gravitational pull of Roman civilization. Their century of rule in North Africa had shown both the incredible possibilities and the ultimate futility of trying to create something entirely new from the ruins of the ancient world. In the end, the Vandals achieved something remarkable and tragic simultaneously. They proved that Rome could be conquered, but they also proved that Rome was unconquerable. Their legacy lived on not in the survival of their people or their kingdom, but in the permanent changes they brought to Mediterranean politics, and the lessons they provided for every barbarian leader who would follow in their footsteps.